The most feared person in Dodge City wasn't Wild Bill Hickok or any gunslinger. It was a 32-year-old widow named Martha, who'd lost her husband 6 months earlier. But here's what nobody talks about. What she did next broke every rule of survival. When Mary Jenkins heard the gunshot that ended her husband's life in a saloon brawl, she had exactly 3 minutes to grieve before her crying baby reminded her that survival had just become her full-time job. The Wild West didn't hand out sympathy cards or government assistance checks. Your man dies? Well, that's Tuesday. Better figure out how to keep the farm running by Wednesday. Death came fast and without warning on the frontier. Gunfights erupted over card games, horse trades, or just because someone looked at someone wrong. A rattlesnake bite could kill a strong man in hours. Cholera swept through towns like wildfire, taking husbands and leaving wives to face winter alone. Farm accidents crushed men under falling trees or trampled them beneath spooked cattle. Makes sense in a place where hospitals were hundreds of miles away, and the closest thing to medical care was a bottle of whiskey and a prayer. The moment a woman became a widow, everything changed. Not gradually, instantly. Yesterday she might have helped with cooking and mending clothes. Today she needed to know how to birth calves, fix broken wagon wheels, and decide which crops would keep her children from starving. The learning curve was steep enough to break your neck. Sarah Thompson found this out when her husband died in a mining accident outside Denver. She'd never even held an axe before, but winter was coming and those logs weren't going to chop themselves. Her 3 kids watched her swing that heavy blade for hours, missing more than hitting, until her hands bled through the makeshift gloves she'd torn from her apron. But here's the thing about desperate people: they learn fast or they die trying. Children became instant partners in survival, rather than little ones to be protected. 8-year-old boys learned to shoot rabbits for dinner. 6-year-old girls mastered the art of milking cows and gathering eggs without getting pecked to pieces. These weren't childhood games anymore. When mama's the only thing standing between your family and starvation, everyone grows up in a hurry. The psychological shock hit different women different ways. Some collapsed under the weight of sudden responsibility, others discovered strength they never knew existed. Elizabeth Carter later wrote in her diary that losing her husband felt like being thrown into deep water with rocks tied to your feet. You either learn to swim real quick or you drown taking your babies with you. Then there's the brutal math of frontier survival. Cattle needed feeding twice a day whether you felt like crying or not. Crops followed nature's schedule, not your grieving timeline. The chickens didn't care that you just buried your husband. They still expected their feed and shelter. Grief became a luxury most widows couldn't afford for more than a few stolen moments after the children fell asleep. Community support existed, but it came with strings attached and expiration dates. Neighbors might help with the funeral and bring a few casseroles, but they had their own families and problems. After a week or two, the covered dishes stopped coming, and the visits grew rare. The unspoken message was clear: figure it out or move on. Some widows packed up immediately and headed back east to family. Can't blame them really. The frontier was hard enough with a partner. Going it alone seemed impossible. But moving cost money most didn't have, and eastern relatives weren't always eager to take in a widow with several hungry mouths to feed. The ones who stayed faced a choice that would define their entire future: sell the land for whatever they could get and hope it lasted, or dig in and fight for what their husbands had died building. Neither option guaranteed success, but one offered the possibility of independence while the other promised only temporary relief. What's fascinating is how quickly many of these women adapted. The same Sarah Thompson who couldn't swing an axe in September was building chicken coops and repairing roof shingles by December. Necessity turned housewives into carpenters, mothers into marksmen, and gentle ladies into shrewd negotiators who could haggle with traders and hold their own in business deals. The children often became their mother's greatest strength and biggest worry rolled into one. They provided extra hands for work and companionship during long, lonely evenings, but they also represented mouths to feed, bodies to clothe, and minds to educate in a place where survival skills mattered more than book learning. Of course, keeping everyone alive was just the beginning. These widows still had to figure out how to work land that had challenged 2 adults, often while learning skills they'd never needed before. The homestead that had been a family dream could quickly become a widow's nightmare, especially when she realized just how much backbreaking work lay ahead. When a husband died on the frontier, his wife didn't get a moment to breathe. The farm didn't care about her tears. Animals still needed feeding at dawn, and fences still broke during storms. What took 2 people before now fell entirely on one woman's shoulders. Most widows had never handled the heavy work. Their husbands managed the plowing, chopping, and building, while wives focused on cooking, cleaning, and children. But death doesn't ask if you're ready to learn carpentry. Winter doesn't wait for you to figure out how to split logs. The land demanded immediate action, and hesitation meant starvation. Take woodcutting, for example. A family needed cords of firewood to survive harsh winters. Men typically spent entire days swinging axes, building calluses thick as leather. When that man died, his widow faced towering trees with blistered hands and aching muscles. She had to learn fast that smaller, frequent cuts worked better than mighty swings that exhausted her after an hour. Then there's the matter of repairs. Frontier homes weren't exactly architectural marvels. Roofs leaked constantly. Door hinges broke from wind and use. Windows needed boarding during storms. These weren't optional fixes either. A leaking roof meant ruined food stores. Broken doors invited wild animals. Or worse, many widows discovered they possessed surprising talent with hammers and nails, even if their first attempts looked pretty rough. Fencing presented another nightmare entirely. Livestock wandered off without proper barriers, and replacing lost cattle meant financial disaster. Fence posts rotted, wire snapped and gates sagged. Some widows learned to set posts by watching neighbors, but others figured it out through expensive trial and error. Nothing taught fence building faster than watching your only cow disappear over a hill. Let's not forget that weather made everything harder. Summer heat turned outdoor work into pure misery, while winter cold made simple tasks nearly impossible. Spring mud sucked boots right off feet, and autumn storms knocked down whatever you'd just finished building. Working alone meant no one helped lift heavy beams or held boards steady. Clever widows learned to use pulleys, levers, and even trained their older children to assist with difficult jobs. The isolation made practical problems feel overwhelming. When something broke on a neighbor's farm, help usually arrived quickly. But widows often lived miles from assistance, and asking for help repeatedly made them feel burdensome. Pride kept many women struggling with tasks that teams of men would tackle together. Some learned to accept that certain jobs took longer when done alone, while others pushed themselves to dangerous exhaustion trying to match their dead husband's pace. Water systems caused constant headaches. Wells needed cleaning, pumps required maintenance, and pipes froze solid during cold snaps. Without running water, everything from cooking to laundry became monumentally difficult. Widows hauled buckets until their arms burned, melted snow when wells ran dry, and learned to fix pump mechanisms through desperate necessity. Well, at least they developed impressive arm strength in the process. Storage buildings demanded attention too. Root cellars kept food from spoiling, but only when properly maintained. Barn roofs protected valuable equipment and feed. Chicken coops needed reinforcement against predators that viewed free meals as personal invitations. Every structure required regular upkeep, and neglecting any one of them created cascading problems that multiplied quickly. Some widows discovered unexpected mechanical aptitude. They fixed wagon wheels, sharpened tools, and even attempted blacksmith work when no alternatives existed. Others found their limitations and focused energy on learning what absolutely couldn't be avoided. The smart ones identified which neighbors might trade skills, maybe fresh bread for fence repairs, or preserved vegetables for roof work. Equipment maintenance became a crucial survival skill. Plows, harrows, and cultivators were expensive to replace and essential for farming success. Widows learned to oil moving parts, replace worn pieces, and improvise solutions when factory parts weren't available. Some became remarkably creative with repairs, using wire, wood, and pure determination to keep machinery functioning. But here's what made the situation truly challenging: time pressure. Certain jobs had to happen on schedule regardless of circumstances. Crops needed planting during specific seasons. Hay required cutting before it spoiled. Harvest couldn't wait for convenient moments. Many widows worked from sunrise to sunset, then continued by lamplight, desperately trying to complete tasks that once seemed manageable with help. The workload forced difficult decisions about priorities. Should she spend time fixing the barn door or preparing winter clothing? Was it better to clear new fields or maintain existing ones? These choices often determined whether families thrived or barely survived the coming seasons. Yet somehow, many widows not only managed these overwhelming responsibilities, but actually improved their properties over time. They learned efficient work methods, developed specialized skills, and proved that determination could overcome almost any obstacle. Still, the physical demands were just the beginning of their struggles. The real test came when they grabbed farming tools and tried to work land that fought back with every step. The morning after burying her husband, Mary Johnson stood in her doorway staring at 40 acres of unbroken prairie soil. The spring planting season wouldn't wait for grief. Her 3 children needed food, and that meant getting crops in the ground within weeks. The problem, she'd never held a plow in her life. Breaking virgin prairie required back-breaking labor that tested even the strongest men. The thick grass roots formed a tough mat called sod that could dull a plow blade in hours. Mary watched her neighbors' fields getting turned, knowing each day of delay meant a shorter growing season. Winter would come whether her crops were ready or not. Most widows inherited farms already established by their husbands, but some faced the nightmare of starting from scratch. The land might be paid for, but raw earth wouldn't feed anybody. Breaking just 1 acre could take a full week of dawn to dusk work. 40 acres. That was a mountain of effort for someone who'd spent her days cooking and mending clothes. Well, Mary learned fast that the plow didn't care about her inexperience. The heavy iron blade caught on every root and stone. Her hands blistered within hours. The oxen sensed her uncertainty and wandered off course, creating crooked furrows that would haunt her harvest. Some days she managed half an acre. Other days, equipment breakdowns or weather stopped work completely. Then there were the livestock demanding attention regardless of planting deadlines. Cows needed milking twice daily whether Mary's back ached or not. Chickens required feeding and protection from foxes. The old mare that pulled the plow needed grain, water, and shelter. Animals operated on their own schedules, not human convenience. Many widows had watched their husbands work, but never actually handled farm tools themselves. Makes sense, right? Division of labor kept households running efficiently when both parents were alive. But suddenly learning to operate a harrow, plant seeds at proper depths, and judge soil moisture became matters of life and death. No pressure there. The physical demands were staggering. Prairie sod fought back against every cut of the plow. Rocks had to be cleared by hand and hauled away. Seed bags weighed 50 pounds each. Harnesses needed constant adjustment and repair. Mary's soft hands turned into leather gloves of calluses and scars. Her back screamed every morning, but the work continued. Weather added another layer of complexity to the challenge. Spring rains could turn fields into muddy swamps, making plowing impossible. Drought meant seeds wouldn't germinate properly. Late frosts killed tender seedlings overnight. Hail could destroy weeks of work in minutes. Nature didn't negotiate or offer second chances. Some widows discovered they lacked the basic knowledge of what to plant and when. Corn needed warm soil. Wheat preferred cooler conditions. Root vegetables required different spacing than grain crops. Timing everything correctly meant the difference between abundance and starvation. One mistake could doom an entire season. But here's where things get interesting. Many of these women developed an almost supernatural determination. Mary Johnson figured out how to modify her plow to cut deeper into stubborn sod. She learned to read weather signs better than some longtime farmers. Her crooked first furrows evolved into perfectly straight rows that impressed her neighbors. The loneliness of field work created its own problems. Hours of solitary labor left too much time for grieving and worry. Would the children be safe alone in the house? Was that cloud formation bringing helpful rain or destructive hail? Could one person really manage what had traditionally required two? Equipment failures in remote fields meant long walks back to get tools or help. A broken harness or bent plow blade could cost precious days. Some widows learned basic blacksmithing to make emergency repairs. Others developed networks of borrowed equipment and shared labor with sympathetic neighbors. Growing enough food was never guaranteed, even with perfect execution. Prairie soils varied dramatically in quality. Some sections produced bumper crops while others barely supported weeds. Widows had to learn their land through trial and error, figuring out which fields worked best for different crops. Crop failures carried devastating consequences. A bad harvest meant choosing between selling valuable livestock for food money or watching the family slowly starve through winter. Some widows rationed food so severely that children suffered permanent health effects. Others abandoned their claims entirely, unable to make the land produce enough for survival. The weird part is how many succeeded, despite seemingly impossible odds. These women transformed from helpless dependents into skilled farmers within a single growing season. They developed muscles their husbands never had, and learned to read soil conditions like experienced agriculturalists. Mary Johnson's first harvest produced enough corn and wheat to feed her family through winter with surplus to sell. Her success came from 16-hour days, stubborn refusal to quit, and hard-won knowledge about prairie farming. But surviving the growing season only solved part of her problems. Because once the crops were harvested and stored, other challenges waited. Winter brought different survival tests, and widows needed more than farming skills to protect their families from the harsh months ahead. When your husband dies and leaves you with a broken plow, hungry children, and winter approaching, you don't get the luxury of a learning curve. These widows had to become experts fast, or they'd starve. Take Mary Henderson, who'd never touched a hammer before her husband got trampled by a spooked horse in 1867. Within 2 weeks, she was building chicken coops and patching barn walls. Her diary entry from that October reads, "Today I fixed the roof leak that's been dripping on little Sarah's bed for 3 days. My hands are bloody, but the roof don't leak no more." The thing about frontier survival, it didn't care about your gender or your previous experience. Fences needed mending whether you were a delicate flower or a seasoned ranch hand. Broken wagon wheels required fixing regardless of how many tears you'd shed that morning. Most fascinating was how quickly these women picked up skills that typically took men years to master. Sarah Mitchell learned to shoe horses by watching the blacksmith work just twice before he died of fever. She practiced on her old mare until she could shoe all 4 hooves in under an hour. Her neighbors started bringing their horses to her by spring. Then there's the hunting situation. Victorian ladies weren't supposed to kill anything bigger than a spider, but hunger has a funny way of changing social rules. Elizabeth Crawford had never fired a gun until bandits shot her husband during a supply run to town. 6 months later, she was bringing down deer with a rifle and setting traps for rabbits like she'd been born to it. But here's what really gets interesting. These widows didn't just learn 1 or 2 new skills, they became walking, talking Swiss Army knives of frontier expertise. Catherine Brooks learned carpentry from a traveling preacher, picked up basic veterinary skills from a retired cavalry officer, and taught herself to tan hides by trial and error. She once wrote to her sister back east, "Yesterday I delivered a calf, fixed the barn door, and made 3 bars of lye soap. I barely recognize myself anymore." The soap making alone was practically chemistry. Mix lye water with animal fat at the wrong temperature, and you'd either get caustic mush that would burn your skin or greasy slop that wouldn't clean anything. Get it right, and you had something valuable to trade or sell. These women figured out ratios and temperatures without textbooks or YouTube tutorials. Improvisation became their superpower. When store-bought tools broke, and they always broke, widows had to get creative. Anna Rodriguez turned broken barrel hoops into makeshift hinges. Margaret O'Sullivan used old horseshoes as hammers when her real hammer's handle snapped. They carved wooden nails when metal ones ran out and made needles from porcupine quills when their sewing supplies vanished. Well, necessity also made them surprisingly good engineers. Building root cellars that wouldn't collapse required understanding soil composition and drainage. Constructing chicken coops that would keep out coyotes meant thinking like both architect and predator. These weren't simple projects. They were complex problems requiring real technical knowledge. Let's not forget the medical skills they developed. With the nearest doctor often hundreds of miles away, widows became their own physicians. They learned to set broken bones using splints made from fence posts, treat infected wounds with honey and salt, and brew willow bark tea for fever. Maria Santos once removed a bullet from her neighbor's shoulder using a kitchen knife sterilized in boiling water. The man lived and worked for another 30 years, but why did they succeed when so many others failed? Pure stubbornness played a part. These women had children depending on them, and dead husbands who trusted them with the family legacy. Failure wasn't just personal embarrassment, it meant death for everyone they loved. Some widows became legendary for their skills. Rachel Thompson earned the nickname Iron Rachel after she learned to forge basic tools and horseshoes. Townspeople started coming to her instead of waiting weeks for the traveling blacksmith. She charged fair prices and never botched a job. The weird part is how much they enjoyed their newfound abilities. Letters and diary entries from the period reveal genuine pride in their accomplishments. They'd gone from helpless dependents to capable, independent operators. Sure, they missed their husbands terribly, but there was also satisfaction in knowing they could handle whatever life threw at them. Makes sense, right? When you discover you can build, fix, hunt, heal, and create with your own hands, it changes how you see yourself. These women went from thinking they needed protection to realizing they were the protection. Their children watched this transformation and learned that survival meant adaptability. Boys and girls alike absorbed lessons in self-reliance that would serve them well in an unforgiving landscape. Of course, all these new skills meant nothing if you couldn't afford basic supplies or had no money coming in. Managing finances became yet another challenge these resourceful widows had to master. Money on the frontier wasn't just scarce, it was practically a myth. Most widows discovered their husbands had left behind debts that made their bank accounts look like black holes. The The local general store owner would show up with a ledger full of unpaid bills. The blacksmith wanted payment for horseshoes. Even the preacher sometimes expected back pay for wedding ceremonies. But here's where frontier widows got creative. They turned their kitchens into cash machines. Every egg their hens laid became currency. Butter churned from their cows could buy necessities at the trading post. Some women discovered they had a talent for baking bread that men would pay premium prices for, especially bachelors who were tired of eating hardtack and beans. The really entrepreneurial widows took in boarders. A spare room could house a traveling merchant or a cowboy looking for winter shelter. These women charged for meals, laundry, and a clean bed. One widow in Kansas reportedly housed 6 men in her small cabin during a particularly harsh winter, charging each one 50 cents a night. She made more money that season than her husband had earned farming all year. Laundry services became another gold mine. Cowboys and miners would pay good money to have their clothes properly cleaned. The work was back-breaking, hauling water, scrubbing on washboards, hanging clothes in all weather, but it paid bills when nothing else would. Then there was bartering, which became an art form. Widows traded homemade soap for flour. Fresh vegetables from their gardens bought them cloth for making clothes. A well-cooked meal might get the roof repaired. One clever woman in Colorado traded her famous apple pies for having her entire barn painted. The painter later claimed those were the best pies west of the Mississippi. Some widows discovered unexpected talents. Sarah Mitchell in Wyoming learned to make furniture after her husband died. She started by fixing a broken chair, then found herself carving new ones from scratch. Local families began ordering tables and cabinets. Her woodworking skills eventually supported her family better than farming ever had. Sewing and mending brought in steady income too. Frontier life was hard on clothes, and most men couldn't even sew on a button. Widows charged for patching torn pants, darning socks, and making new shirts. The women who could embroider or add decorative touches charged even more. Fancy stitching was rare on the frontier, making it valuable. But here's the brutal truth about frontier economics. Crop failures could wipe out everything. A widow might spend months building up savings from selling eggs and butter, only to lose her chickens to a fox or her cow to disease. Weather destroyed gardens that were supposed to feed the family and provide surplus for trade. Drought, floods, or early frost could eliminate an entire season's income in days. Winter was always the test. Smart widows spent summer and fall stockpiling not just food but anything that could be traded when money ran short. They dried extra vegetables, preserved more meat than needed, and made extra soap or candles. These supplies became emergency currency when cash disappeared. The stress of managing money never ended. Every purchase required careful calculation. Should she buy nails to fix the fence or save the money for winter boots for the children? Was it worth spending precious coins on medicine, or should she try homemade remedies instead? These decisions kept widows awake at night. Some got creative with credit arrangements. A widow might promise a portion of her next harvest in exchange for seeds now. Others worked out deals where they provided services throughout the year, in exchange for major purchases. One woman in Texas agreed to cook for harvest crews every fall, in exchange for having her fields plowed each spring. The psychological pressure was intense. Money problems didn't just threaten comfort, they threatened survival. A widow who couldn't pay her debts might lose her land. Without land, she had nowhere to grow food or keep livestock. The entire foundation of frontier survival could crumble over unpaid bills. Yet many widows discovered they were better with money than their husbands had been. They kept careful records, planned purchases, and found ways to stretch every dollar. Some even managed to save money despite their harsh circumstances. These women developed financial skills that would serve them for life. The irony wasn't lost on them. While they struggled to afford basic necessities, they were building businesses and developing economic skills that many wealthy women back east never learned. Frontier poverty forced creativity that prosperity rarely demanded. But managing money was just one battle in the constant war against the elements themselves. Even the most successful widow entrepreneur could lose everything when nature decided to show its power, which happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. Managing money after losing a husband meant facing a brutal reality. Most men didn't leave behind treasure chests filled with gold coins. Instead, widows often inherited debts, unpaid bills, and maybe a few dollars hidden in a coffee tin. The romantic notion of frontier prosperity, pure fantasy for most families scraping by on the edge of survival. Debts had a nasty habit of multiplying after a man's death. Store owners wanted payment for seed bought on credit. The blacksmith expected money for horseshoes and tool repairs. Sometimes the land itself came with mortgage payments that didn't pause for grief. Creditors showed up at the door with ledger books and stern expressions, expecting payment regardless of tears or excuses. Smart widows learned to hustle in ways their husbands never imagined. Chicken eggs became liquid gold when sold to neighbors or at the general store. A dozen eggs might buy flour, sugar, or lamp oil. Butter churned from cow's milk brought in steady cash, especially during winter months when other sources dried up. The irony: women's traditional skills suddenly became the foundation of family survival. Then there were the creative entrepreneurs who turned necessity into opportunity. Some widows discovered they could make decent money taking in laundry from bachelors and traveling salesmen. Hot water, lye soap, and strong arms transformed dirty clothes into clean cash. Others opened their homes to boarders, cooking meals and providing beds for a steady monthly income. Makes sense, right? Handmade goods offered another lifeline for women with nimble fingers. Quilts stitched during long winter evenings sold for enough to buy supplies. Knitted socks, mittens and scarves found eager buyers among cowboys and railroad workers. Soap made from animal fat and wood ash became a valuable trade commodity. One widow's trash literally became another family's treasure. Bartering ruled the frontier economy more than actual money. A skilled widow might trade fresh bread for candles or exchange vegetables from her garden for ammunition. The local trading post became a hub of complex negotiations where everything had value. Dried meat, preserved fruits and even medicinal herbs could be swapped for tools, cloth or other necessities. Cash was nice, but useful goods kept families alive. Poor harvests created financial nightmares that haunted every widow's dreams. A failed corn crop meant no income from surplus grain sales. Dead chickens from disease eliminated the egg money. Cattle dying from harsh winters wiped out entire nest eggs in brutal fashion. Weather didn't care about bills or hungry children, and neither did the calendar when payment deadlines arrived. Well, some widows got creative with seasonal work opportunities. During harvest time, they hired themselves out to neighbors for picking, threshing, or canning. Spring brought fence mending jobs and garden planting work. Summer meant extra income from selling fresh produce at town markets. Winter offered opportunities for mending clothes, making preserves, or teaching children basic reading and arithmetic. The weird part is how some women discovered hidden talents for business after their husbands died. Wives who had never handled money suddenly became sharp negotiators at the general store. Women who had been sheltered from financial decisions learned to calculate profit margins on homemade goods. Necessity transformed gentle housewives into tough businesswomen who could spot a bad deal from across the room. But why did some widows struggle more than others with money management? Education played a huge role in financial survival. Women who could read and write kept better records of debts and credits. They understood contracts and weren't easily cheated by unscrupulous merchants. Illiterate widows often found themselves at the mercy of others who claimed to help, but sometimes helped themselves to widows' resources. Let's not forget the importance of timing in a widow's financial survival. Women who lost husbands just before harvest season had crops to sell for immediate cash. Those widowed in spring faced months of expenses before any income arrived. Winter deaths meant burning through firewood and food supplies with no way to replenish either until warmer weather returned. Community connections often determined whether a widow sank or swam financially. Women with good reputations found neighbors willing to buy their goods or offer work opportunities. Those who had feuded with others or came from outside the community discovered how quickly doors could close when money became tight. Social capital translated directly into economic survival on the frontier. Some widows learned painful lessons about mixing friendship with business transactions. Lending money to neighbors in distress sometimes meant never seeing those funds again. Extending credit for goods and services created awkward situations when payment never materialized. Trust became a luxury many widows couldn't afford after being burned by people they thought were reliable. The constant worry about winter survival shaped every financial decision throughout the year. Would there be enough money for warm coats before the snow flew? Could the family afford sufficient firewood and lamp oil for the dark months? These questions haunted widows through every transaction, making them careful with every penny while knowing that being too careful might mean missing opportunities for income. Managing money as a frontier widow meant mastering skills no finishing school ever taught, but financial survival was only part of the daily battle these women faced. When your husband dies on the frontier, grief becomes a luxury you can't afford. Not when you've got mouths to feed and winter coming. These widows faced an impossible reality. keeping their children alive in a place that seemed designed to kill them. Food came first always, but feeding a family on the frontier wasn't like running to the store. Widows had to hunt, trap, forage and grow everything their children needed to survive. Mary Henderson's diary from 1872 tells of stretching one chicken into soup for 6 days, adding wild onions and prairie grass seeds to make it last. When the soup ran thin, she'd boil the bones again. Then there's the brutal math of frontier life. One bad harvest meant watching your children grow thinner each day. Children as young as 5 learned to set snares for rabbits. 6-year-olds gathered buffalo chips for fuel while their mothers plowed. This wasn't child labor as we think of it today. This was survival training. These kids learned to milk cows before they could properly spell their names. They had to. One widow in Kansas trained her 8-year-old son to shoot because she couldn't be everywhere at once. The boy killed his first deer when most kids today are learning multiplication tables. Winter brought the real test. Sarah Mitchell, widowed in Wyoming, wrote about rationing food so carefully that she knew exactly how many beans each child could eat per day. She'd count them out at breakfast, making a game of it so the kids wouldn't know how desperate things were. When her youngest asked for seconds, she'd distract him with stories instead of admitting the food was gone. But here's where these frontier mothers showed their genius. They turned survival into education. Children learned to identify edible plants, track animals, and read weather patterns. A 10-year-old could tell you which berries would kill you and which would keep you alive through winter. These weren't just chores. They were life insurance policies written in practical knowledge. Disease posed another nightmare. When scarlet fever hit a homestead, there was no doctor to call. Margaret Thompson watched 3 of her neighbors' children die from whooping cough before it reached her cabin. She quarantined her own kids for 2 months, refusing to let them play with other children. She taught them to make their own entertainment, whittling, storytelling, and shadow puppets on the cabin wall. Sometimes isolation was the only medicine that worked. Then there were the orphaned children who found their way to widows' cabins. These women, barely managing to feed their own families, somehow made room for one more mouth. Elizabeth Curtis took in 4 children whose parents died of typhus. She already had 3 of her own. 7 children in a 2-room cabin. With winter approaching and no husband to help, she made it work by organizing the older children to care for the younger ones, creating a family hierarchy that functioned like a small business. Teaching became survival strategy. Widows who could read and write often held school in their cabins during winter months. They'd charge other families in food or firewood. Catherine Bell taught 12 children in her kitchen, using charcoal on wooden boards when paper ran out. The income helped feed her own children, and the knowledge she passed on helped entire communities survive. Some widows made impossible choices about their children's futures. When food grew too scarce, they'd send older children to work for neighboring families. A 14-year-old might leave home to help with harvest, knowing his wages in food and shelter meant his younger siblings could eat. These weren't abandonments. They were chess moves in a deadly game where every decision meant life or death. Children learned to lie about their circumstances when they went to town. They'd been coached to say everything was fine at home, that mama was doing well. Pride mattered, but so did avoiding unwanted attention from men who might see a struggling widow as an opportunity. Smart children became part of their mother's security system. The psychological toll was enormous, but these mothers found ways to protect their children's spirits. They'd save precious sugar for birthday celebrations, making tiny cakes from cornmeal and wild honey. They'd create elaborate Christmas celebrations from corn husk dolls and carved wooden toys. Childhood had to exist somehow, even in the midst of constant danger. Despite everything working against them, many of these children thrived. They grew up resourceful, resilient, and capable of handling anything life threw at them. But keeping them alive meant more than just providing food and shelter. It meant creating hope in hopeless situations, and hope was exactly what these widows needed when facing the next challenge. Because while they were busy keeping their children fed and safe, hostile neighbors were watching from a distance, and not all of them had good intentions. Life on the frontier could be harsh enough with support, but widows faced an additional challenge that made survival even more dangerous. Not everyone in their communities had their backs. Some neighbors who should have offered help instead saw opportunity in a woman's vulnerability. The reality was brutal and simple. When word spread that a woman was managing a homestead alone, certain men viewed this as a chance to take advantage. These weren't always strangers or outlaws either. Sometimes the biggest threats came from people widows had known for years, neighbors who had shared meals with their families, traders who had conducted honest business with their husbands, even local officials who were supposed to keep the peace. Property disputes became a constant worry. A widow might wake up to find her fence posts moved overnight, her boundary markers mysteriously shifted. Men would claim her husband had promised them grazing rights or owed them money, without witnesses or legal documents, which were rare on the frontier anyway. These disputes often came down to one person's word against another's. Guess who usually lost? Then there was the market manipulation that happened almost everywhere. Widows quickly learned that the price of goods seemed to change depending on who was doing the buying. A pound of flour that cost one amount for a married couple somehow cost significantly more when a lone woman approached the counter. The same applied in reverse when selling. Eggs, butter, or handmade goods that fetched fair prices from other customers brought offers so low they were practically insults when widows tried to trade them. But the most unsettling part was how some men felt entitled to make decisions for widows without being asked. They'd show up unannounced to inspect property, claiming they were just being neighborly. These visits often came with suggestions that sounded more like demands. Maybe she should sell her land, maybe she needed a man to help manage things, maybe her children would be better off with other families. The underlying message was always clear: you don't belong here alone. Physical intimidation took many forms. Some widows reported finding their tools moved or damaged overnight. Livestock would mysteriously end up in the wrong pastures. Wells might get contaminated or blocked. These weren't accidents. They were messages designed to wear down a woman's resolve and force her to depend on others or give up entirely. Night brought its own special terrors. Widows often described hearing footsteps around their homes after dark, seeing shapes moving near their windows, or finding evidence that someone had been on their property while they slept. The psychological warfare was deliberate and effective. Fear could accomplish what direct confrontation might not. Law enforcement, when it existed at all, rarely offered real protection. Most frontier towns had limited resources for keeping the peace, and a widow's complaints often received low priority. Deputies and sheriffs were frequently overwhelmed with more serious crimes like cattle rustling or saloon brawls. A woman reporting harassment or threats might get sympathetic nods, but actual help was another matter entirely. The legal system itself worked against women, even when widows had legitimate grievances. Courts heavily favored men's testimony. A woman's word carried less weight in legal proceedings, and many judges believed women were naturally prone to hysteria or exaggeration. This reputation made it even harder for widows to get justice when they were genuinely wronged. Some communities developed informal but powerful ways to pressure widows into conforming to expectations. Gossip could destroy a woman's reputation overnight. Whispers about her moral character, her parenting, or her ability to manage affairs would spread through town like wildfire. Social isolation often followed, making it nearly impossible to find help or conduct business. Religious communities sometimes proved just as problematic as secular ones. While many church groups offered genuine assistance, others used moral authority to control widows' choices. Ministers might preach about women's proper roles, or suggest that a widow's struggles were divine punishment for some failing. The pressure to remarry often came wrapped in religious language about God's plan and women's need for male guidance. Yet despite all this hostility, something remarkable happened. Many widows refused to be intimidated. They learned to document suspicious activities, formed alliances with trustworthy neighbors, and developed strategies to protect themselves and their interests. Some became known for their sharp tongues and willingness to call out bad behavior publicly. Others learned to navigate the system by building relationships with honest merchants and fair-minded community leaders. The widows who survived these challenges often emerged stronger and more determined than before. They understood that respect had to be earned through strength, not sympathy. They learned to spot trouble before it arrived and developed the skills needed to defend themselves and their families. However, even the toughest widows knew that human hostility wasn't their only concern. The frontier attracted another type of threat entirely, one that came with guns drawn and had no interest in subtle intimidation games. Facing down hostile neighbors was one thing, but actual criminals, that was a whole different nightmare. Outlaws roamed the Wild West like wolves, and they had a particular appetite for what they saw as easy prey. Widows living alone with their children. Bandits weren't stupid. They knew exactly which homesteads had lost their men. News traveled fast in small frontier communities, and within weeks of a husband's death, every lowlife within 50 miles knew there was a woman alone with whatever valuables she might have stashed away. Some widows had saved up a few coins from selling eggs or butter. Others might own decent livestock or farming tools. To desperate criminals, that was worth the risk. Mary Catherine Williams learned this the hard way when 3 men showed up at her Kansas homestead just 2 months after her husband died in a farming accident. They demanded food, money, and anything else of value. Mary Catherine had her 2 young sons hide in the root cellar while she faced the men with nothing but a kitchen knife and sheer determination. Lucky for her, they were more interested in easy pickings than a fight. They took what little food she had and rode off, but the message was clear: she was a target now. Then there were widows who decided they weren't going to be anyone's victim. Sarah McKinney of Colorado became legendary for her creative approach to self-defense after outlaws hit her farm twice in 1 month. The 3rd time they came around, Sarah was ready. She'd rigged up a series of tin cans filled with rocks around her property. When the cans rattled, she knew trouble was coming. But Sarah's real genius was her solution to the problem itself. She started dressing like a man when she worked outside, cut her hair short, wore her late husband's clothes, and practiced walking and talking like a fellow. From a distance, potential troublemakers thought she had male help around the place. Word got around that the McKinney place had hired hands, and the raid stopped. Sarah never told anyone the truth until years later, when she was safely remarried and could laugh about her deception. Dogs became a widow's best friend in more ways than one. These weren't pampered pets. They were working animals trained to bark at strangers, and if necessary bite. A good dog could hear riders approaching long before human ears picked up the sound. Some widows kept 2 or 3 dogs specifically for security. The dogs slept near the door and knew the difference between a neighbor stopping by and potential danger approaching under cover of darkness. But let's not forget the widows who took a more direct approach to the outlaw problem. Catherine Big Kate Morrison of Montana stood nearly 6 feet tall and could shoot a rifle better than most men. When 4 bandits tried to rob her ranch, Big Kate didn't hide or negotiate. She grabbed her deceased husband's Winchester, took position behind a water trough, and started shooting. The outlaws expected a scared woman, not a marksman who could put bullets exactly where she wanted them. 2 of the men were wounded, and all 4 rode away faster than they'd arrived. Stories like Kate's spread quickly through frontier communities, and that was exactly the point. Outlaws preferred easy targets, not dangerous ones. When word got around that certain widows would fight back, many criminals moved on to what they hoped would be softer targets. The reputation for being tough was often just as valuable as actually being tough. Some widows banded together for protection, especially those living close enough to help each other. They'd work out signals: a gunshot in the air meant trouble, and neighbors would come running with weapons ready. This informal network made outlaws think twice about targeting any one widow, since they never knew who else might show up to help. The fear was real though. Many widows spent sleepless nights listening for sounds that didn't belong. Every creaking board or unexpected noise outside could mean danger. Some women moved their children's beds into their own rooms and kept loaded guns within reach. The stress of constant vigilance wore down even the strongest women, but the alternative, being defenseless, wasn't acceptable. Outlaws weren't always strangers, either. Sometimes they were local men who figured a widow wouldn't dare accuse someone from her own community. These cases were particularly difficult, because the woman had to continue living near her attackers, often with no legal recourse available. The weird part is how creative some widows became in their defensive strategies. They'd spread rumors about having dangerous relatives coming to visit, or they'd leave men's clothes hanging on the line to suggest male presence. Some even went so far as to pay local cowboys a few cents to ride past their property regularly, just so potential troublemakers would think the place was being watched. Despite all these precautions and stories of successful resistance, the threat of outlaws remained a constant shadow over widowed life on the frontier. But even that wasn't the deepest challenge these women faced daily. Fighting off bandits and protecting livestock was just the beginning of what these women faced. The silence afterward hit harder than any gunshot ever could. Weeks stretched into months without hearing another adult voice. Can you wrap your head around that level of isolation? These widows lived miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but wind and their own thoughts for company. The nearest town might be a full day's ride away, and winter storms could cut them off completely for weeks at a time. Sarah McKinley wrote in her diary about talking to her chickens just to hear conversation. Had a long chat with Henrietta about the weather today, she scribbled in faded ink. She's a better listener than my late husband ever was. Dark humor became a survival tool when the alternative was losing your mind to the endless quiet. The psychological weight was crushing. These women had lost their life partners, taken on impossible workloads, and now faced the additional burden of complete social isolation. Depression wasn't a recognized condition back then, but the symptoms were real enough. Some widows reported feeling like they were disappearing, becoming invisible even to themselves. Mail delivery offered a lifeline, but letters took weeks or months to reach their destinations. By the time a widow received a response to her plea for companionship, the seasons had often changed. Weather delays made communication even more unpredictable. A widow might pour her heart out in January and not hear back until spring thaw. Then there were the practical challenges loneliness created. When you're sick with fever, and there's no one to fetch water or tend the fire, isolation becomes life-threatening. Mary Patterson nearly died from pneumonia because she was too weak to split firewood for 3 days. Her neighbor found her delirious and half-frozen when he finally rode by to check on her cattle. Some widows kept detailed journals, treating the pages like confidants. These diaries reveal the raw emotional struggles behind all that frontier toughness. "The walls feel like they're closing in," wrote Elizabeth Crawford. "I caught myself setting 2 plates for supper again. Old habits die harder than husbands, it seems." Religious faith provided mental anchor points for many isolated widows. Prayer became conversation when no other voices were available. Bible reading filled long evenings when candles were too precious to waste on leisure activities. Some women claimed they could feel God's presence more clearly in the vast silence of the frontier. Others admitted they sometimes shouted at the heavens just to hear their own voices echo back. The weird part is how some widows actually began to fear human contact after extended isolation. When visitors finally arrived, these women sometimes felt overwhelmed by the noise and social demands. Margaret Sullivan wrote about hiding in her root cellar when she spotted riders approaching, too anxious to face the effort of conversation after months of solitude. Children helped break the silence, but they also added pressure. Kids needed attention, comfort, and guidance that emotionally drained mothers were struggling to provide. Some widows worried they were failing their children by being too sad or distant. Others threw themselves into child-rearing with desperate intensity, treating their kids as the only meaningful connection to the living world. Wild animals became unlikely companions. Prairie dogs, hawks, even the occasional wolf pack provided movement and life in otherwise empty landscapes. One widow in Kansas claimed she could predict weather changes by watching how her neighborhood coyotes behaved. These weren't pets exactly, but they represented life continuing around her when everything felt dead. Winter isolation hit differently than summer loneliness. Blizzards could trap widows inside crude cabins for days at a time. The sound of wind became constant background noise, sometimes driving women to stuff rags in their ears just to experience different kinds of quiet. Cabin fever was real, and it was dangerous. But here's what's remarkable about human adaptability. Many widows developed coping strategies that would impress modern therapists. They created elaborate daily routines to provide structure. They talked to photographs of dead husbands. They invented games and projects to keep their minds occupied during the longest stretches alone. Some even found unexpected benefits in the solitude. Without social expectations or judgment, these women could be completely themselves. They could curse, cry, or sing off-key without worrying about propriety. A few described feeling closer to nature and more self-aware than ever before. Letters from this period reveal women discovering inner strength they never knew existed. "I am becoming someone I never met before," wrote one widow. "She is tougher than I expected, and lonelier than I feared, but she is entirely mine." The mental fortitude required to survive such isolation was extraordinary. These women had to be their own therapists, entertainers, and companions while managing everything else frontier life demanded. Yet even the strongest widows knew that complete isolation was unsustainable. They began reaching out, creating networks, and finding ways to build community connections that could sustain them through the hardest times. After weeks of struggling alone with broken plows and failing crops, many Wild West widows discovered something remarkable. Help existed, but it came with unwritten rules and expectations that could make or break their survival. Community support wasn't just about kindness, it was business. When harvest time arrived and a widow faced acres of wheat she couldn't possibly gather alone, neighbors might show up with their own tools and strong backs, but they remembered every favor. That widow would owe them work during their harvest, meals for their families, or whatever other debts the community decided to collect later. Church groups operated as the closest thing to organized charity on the frontier. Methodist and Baptist congregations often pooled resources to help struggling widows through harsh winters. They'd arrive with flour, salt pork, and hand-me-down clothes for the children. Yet even this generosity came with strings attached. Widows receiving church aid were expected to attend services regularly, follow strict moral codes, and sometimes endure lectures about proper Christian behavior. Some widows found the scrutiny more exhausting than the actual poverty. Then there were the legendary barn raisings and house-building bees. When Martha Sullivan's roof collapsed during a spring storm in Kansas, her entire community showed up the next Saturday morning with hammers and lumber. By sunset she had a new roof and walls that would last through winter. These events turned back-breaking labor into social gatherings, complete with fiddle music and enormous communal meals. Women cooked while men built, children played, and everyone understood that Martha would return the favor when someone else needed help. But community acceptance wasn't automatic, especially for outsider widows. Women who'd arrived from back east or whose husbands had been considered troublemakers often found themselves excluded from mutual aid networks. Sarah Chen, a Chinese-American widow in California, discovered that her vegetable garden skills were welcome, but full community membership remained forever out of reach. The same neighbors who bought her produce would never invite her children to play with theirs. Trading favors became an art form among frontier women. A widow skilled at sewing might repair clothes for 3 families in exchange for firewood and winter meat. Another might teach reading to neighborhood children while their mothers helped with her laundry. These informal arrangements created webs of interdependence that kept entire communities functioning when cash money was scarce. Some towns developed rotating work schedules during planting and harvest seasons. Widows would band together with other struggling families, moving from farm to farm in organized groups. One week they'd plant corn at the Johnson place. The next they'd help the widow Rodriguez repair her fences. The system worked because everyone understood the rules, and everyone eventually benefited. Well, almost everyone. Community support had its dark side too. Gossip networks that spread news about who needed help also spread judgment about who deserved it. Widows who drank, cursed, or failed to maintain proper feminine behavior might find their requests for assistance mysteriously ignored. The same community that could rebuild a barn in one day could also destroy a reputation in an afternoon. Religious differences created additional complications. Catholic widows in predominantly Protestant towns sometimes found charity doors closed to them. Jewish families faced even greater isolation in many frontier communities. These women had to work twice as hard to prove their worth and earn acceptance from neighbors who viewed them with suspicion. Children played crucial roles in community relationships. A widow's youngsters could earn goodwill by helping elderly neighbors with chores or running errands for busy families. Smart widows taught their children to be useful and polite, knowing that community affection for the kids often translated into support for the entire family. Community events served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. Quilting bees allowed women to complete massive sewing projects while sharing news, recipes, and survival tips. Church socials provided opportunities for widows to demonstrate their cooking skills and social respectability. Even seemingly simple gatherings like Sunday picnics were actually complex networking events where alliances formed and dissolved. Weather emergencies revealed both the best and worst of frontier communities. During blizzards, neighbors might risk their lives to check on isolated widows and deliver food supplies. But when resources became truly scarce, community loyalty could evaporate quickly. The widow who'd received help all summer might find herself competing with former friends for limited winter supplies. Some widows learned to manipulate community dynamics to their advantage. They'd volunteer for unpopular tasks like caring for sick neighbors or cleaning the church, building up social credit they could cash in during emergencies. Others discovered that hosting community meetings in their homes elevated their status and guaranteed regular visitors who could provide help when needed. The most successful community relationships required careful balance. Widows had to appear grateful for assistance without seeming helpless, independent without seeming ungrateful, and moral without seeming self-righteous. It was emotional tightrope walking that exhausted many women almost as much as the physical labor of frontier life. Others' community networks, flawed as they were, kept countless families alive through impossible circumstances. When formal support systems didn't exist, informal ones filled the gap through necessity and human decency. But what happened when even friendly communities couldn't provide what widows needed most? When desperation hits rock bottom, people find help in the most unexpected places. All Wild West widows quickly learned that survival meant setting aside old prejudices and accepting wisdom from anyone willing to share it. Native American tribes, often viewed with suspicion by white settlers, became unlikely teachers for women who had nowhere else to turn. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Many of these same widows had crossed the plains fearing Indian attacks, clutching their children close whenever they spotted smoke signals on the horizon. But hunger has a way of changing perspectives fast. When your cupboards are empty and winter's approaching, you don't care where knowledge comes from, you just need it to work. Take Sarah Mitchell, a widow near what's now Colorado. After her husband died from a rattlesnake bite, she found herself alone with 3 kids and no idea how to find food beyond her failing vegetable patch. Local Ute women noticed her struggling and began leaving small bundles of wild onions and pine nuts near her fence. At first, Sarah was terrified. Were they poisoning her family, testing her defenses? Well, desperation won out over fear. Those pine nuts kept her children from starving that first brutal month. Soon, Sarah was venturing closer to the Ute camp, gesturing and pointing, trying to learn which plants were safe and which would kill you. The language barrier meant everything had to be shown, not told, but hungry people learn fast. Native tribes possessed centuries of survival knowledge that no Eastern settler could match. They knew which roots stayed nutritious through winter, how to find water in drought conditions, and which tree barks could cure everything from headaches to infected wounds. For widows facing medical emergencies with no doctor for hundreds of miles, this knowledge meant the difference between life and death. Mary Thompson learned to make willow bark tea from Cheyenne women after her youngest son developed a dangerous fever. The aspirin-like compounds in the bark brought his temperature down when her store-bought remedies failed completely. She later credited those women with saving her boy's life. Makes sense, right? These tribes had been keeping children alive in harsh conditions long before white settlers arrived with their limited medical bags. Then there's the matter of food preservation. Eastern women knew how to salt pork and dry vegetables, but they had no experience with buffalo jerky or pemmican, concentrated meat cakes that could last for months without spoiling. Lakota women taught several widows how to pound dried meat with berries and fat, creating portable food that wouldn't rot during long winters. This wasn't just sharing recipes, it was sharing survival itself. Some widows learned hunting techniques that went far beyond pointing and shooting. Plains tribes taught them how to track wounded animals, how to use every part of a kill so nothing went to waste, and how to hunt smaller game like rabbits and prairie dogs when larger animals were scarce. A few widows even learned to make their own arrows and repair damaged rifles using bone and sinew. But the weird part is how these relationships developed despite decades of mutual mistrust. Trading posts often served as neutral ground where widows and tribal women could interact safely. A widow might bring needles or sugar to trade for dried meat or medicinal herbs. These transactions slowly built trust between women who shared similar struggles, keeping families alive in an unforgiving landscape. Not every interaction ended peacefully, of course. Some tribes remained hostile to all white settlers, viewing them as invaders who'd stolen their lands and killed their buffalo. Other widows were too frightened or prejudiced to accept help from people they'd been taught to fear. Pride played a role too. Some women preferred to starve rather than accept charity from savages, as they unfortunately called them. Yet the widows who overcame these barriers often developed genuine friendships. They learned to communicate through gestures, shared tasks, and simple words from each other's languages. Children from both cultures sometimes played together while their mothers worked. These small moments of humanity bridged enormous cultural divides. The most successful partnerships involved mutual teaching. While tribal women shared wilderness survival skills, widows offered knowledge of reading, writing, and dealing with white traders. Some native women learned to sew with metal needles and thread, while widows mastered the art of brain-tanning hides for winter clothing. Both sides gained valuable skills that improved their families' chances of survival. Religious differences created tension, but practical needs often overruled theological concerns. A Kiowa woman showing a widow how to find edible roots wasn't trying to convert anyone, she was simply sharing knowledge that kept people alive. Similarly, a widow teaching basic arithmetic wasn't preaching Christianity, she was giving tribal children tools for dealing with white merchants. These unexpected alliances proved that survival transcends cultural boundaries. When facing starvation, disease, or brutal weather, people discover that wisdom comes in many forms. The widows who embraced these lessons gained advantages that their more stubborn neighbors lacked. They learned to see the land through older, wiser eyes. However, these relationships couldn't solve every problem widows faced. Sometimes the greatest threats came not from nature or starvation, but from their own communities. Survival in the Wild West often came down to impossible choices. For widowed mothers, one of the hardest decisions involved their teenage daughters. When winter approached and food ran low, Desperate times called for desperate measures. Marriage wasn't about love on the frontier. It was about staying alive. A 14-year-old girl might find herself walking down the aisle, not because she wanted to, but because her widowed mother knew she couldn't feed another mouth through the harsh months ahead. These arrangements weren't cruelty, they were mathematics. One less person to feed meant the younger children might survive until spring. The weird part is how quickly these decisions had to be made. A traveling merchant might arrive in October, looking for a wife before heading to California. The widow had maybe 2 days to decide if her eldest daughter should go with him. 2 days to weigh a stranger's character against the very real possibility of watching her family starve. Some mothers said yes, others grabbed their shotguns and ran the man off their property. Then there were the widows who chose remarriage for themselves. Pride was a luxury they couldn't afford when winter winds started howling. A woman might bury her husband in June and marry his neighbor by September. The community understood, even if they whispered about it behind closed doors. Survival trumped social niceties every single time, but remarriage created its own problems. Blended families on the frontier weren't like modern sitcoms. Picture this, a widow with 3 kids marrying a widower with 4 of his own. 7 children, 2 adults, 1 tiny cabin, and barely enough food for 5 people. The math didn't work, but somehow they made it work anyway. Older kids took on adult responsibilities, while younger ones learned to make do with less of everything. Some stepmothers found themselves caring for children who resented their presence. Makes sense, right? A 10-year-old boy who lost his mother to childbirth didn't necessarily want some stranger telling him what to do. Meanwhile, the new stepmother was trying to keep everyone alive while grieving her own losses. These households ran on necessity, not affection, though genuine care often developed over time. Well, not every widow chose the marriage route. Some women flat out refused to remarry, even when their situations looked hopeless. They'd rather face bandits, blizzards, and bankruptcy than give up their independence. Their neighbors called them stubborn. History might call them ahead of their time. Community pressure was relentless. Church ladies would arrive with casseroles and not-so-subtle suggestions about eligible bachelors in town. "Mrs. Henderson, that nice Mr. Patterson has been asking about you," they'd hint while eyeing the widow's patched dress and tired face. The subtext was clear: you need a man to survive out here. The financial aspect couldn't be ignored. A widow inheriting debt along with her husband's land faced a brutal choice. Marry someone who could pay off the creditors, or lose everything and become completely dependent on charity. Some women signed their names to marriage certificates the same way they might sign away a deed, as a business transaction necessary for survival. Children caught in these situations learned harsh lessons about adult priorities. A 12-year-old might watch his mother marry a man who barely tolerated kids, understanding that this arrangement meant they'd have food through winter. Resentment mixed with gratitude in ways that shaped frontier children's views of love, marriage, and survival for the rest of their lives. Let's not forget the men in these arrangements. Widowers with failing homesteads needed wives who could cook, clean, and help with farming. Bachelors wanted families but lacked the social skills to court women under normal circumstances. The frontier's harsh realities created a marriage market where practical needs mattered more than romantic ideals. Some of these survival marriages worked out surprisingly well. Shared hardships created bonds that might have taken years to develop under easier circumstances. A couple who survived their first winter together, keeping all their combined children alive, had accomplished something significant. Mutual respect could grow from that kind of partnership. Others ended badly. Domestic violence was hard to escape when the nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away and winter made travel impossible. Some women found themselves trapped in situations worse than widowhood, with no legal recourse and nowhere to run. The gamble of remarriage didn't always pay off. The most successful widow remarriages seemed to involve clear expectations from the start. Both parties understood they were entering a business partnership focused on survival. Romance might develop later, but the immediate goal was making it through the next season alive with all the children fed and sheltered. But marriage wasn't the only path forward for desperate frontier widows. Some discovered they possessed business instincts that could rival any man's entrepreneurial spirit. These women would carve out entirely different survival strategies that shocked their communities and challenged every assumption about what females could accomplish in the Wild West. Marriage proposals came fast and furious for frontier widows. Sometimes within weeks of burying their husbands, local men would start circling like vultures around fresh meat. The logic seemed simple enough to everyone else. A woman alone couldn't possibly survive, and a man needed someone to cook his meals and mend his socks. Problem solved, right? Well, not every widow got that memo. Martha Henderson shocked her entire Nebraska town when she turned down 3 marriage proposals in 1 month. The local banker, a rancher, and even the preacher himself had all asked for her hand. Each time Martha politely declined, and went right back to running her late husband's grain operation. Folks whispered that grief had made her lose her mind. How else could you explain a woman choosing backbreaking farm work over the security of remarriage? But Martha wasn't crazy, she was calculating. Her husband had left her a profitable business, and she'd be damned if she was going to hand it over to some man who'd probably run it into the ground. The grain operation made good money, enough to hire help when she needed it, and keep food on the table year-round. Why trade independence for dependence? Then there was the clothing situation that really got people's underwear in a bunch. Practical widows quickly discovered that long skirts and corsets weren't exactly designed for mucking out horse stalls or fixing broken wagon wheels, so they adapted. Some rolled up their sleeves and hemlines, others went further. Sarah Collins caused quite the stir when she started wearing her deceased husband's work clothes around her ranch. Boots, pants, flannel shirts, the whole masculine ensemble. The scandal nearly gave the town's church ladies apoplexy. But Sarah's cattle didn't care what she wore, and neither did the wolves that occasionally threatened her livestock. Try shooting a rifle accurately while wearing a bustle. Good luck with that. These clothing choices weren't just about comfort. Dressing like a man could provide actual protection. A lone woman traveling to town made an easy target for troublemakers, but a figure in men's clothing, especially at a distance, might make potential threats think twice. Sarah discovered that wearing pants and keeping her hair tucked under a hat bought her respect at the livestock auctions. Buyers negotiated with her instead of trying to cheat her. Legal battles became another battlefield where widows defied expectations. Property laws in most territories heavily favored men, but some widows fought back anyway. They sued neighbors who tried to steal their land. They challenged creditors who attempted to collect debts that didn't exist. They demanded equal treatment at banks and trading posts. Rebecca Martinez spent 2 years in court fighting her brother-in-law for control of her late husband's ranch. According to him, women had no business owning property, especially not Mexican women. According to Rebecca, he could take his opinions and shove them where the sun doesn't shine. She might have used slightly more colorful language in Spanish. The legal fees nearly bankrupted her, but she won. The ranch stayed in her name, and her brother-in-law learned that underestimating Rebecca was a costly mistake. Running businesses without male oversight sent shockwaves through established social order. Widows discovered they had sharp business minds that had been gathering dust during their marriages. They negotiated contracts, managed employees, and made deals that would make seasoned businessmen jealous. Some became so successful that men who'd previously pitied them started asking for loans. The weird part is how these defiant widows gradually earned grudging respect from their communities. Towns that initially whispered about their unnatural behavior eventually bragged about having such capable women as residents. A widow who could deliver a difficult calf, negotiate a fair price for grain, and still make the best apple pie in 3 counties became a source of local pride. But this transformation didn't happen overnight or without cost. These women faced constant criticism, social isolation, and financial pressure to conform. Many dealt with family members who begged them to act normal and marry again. The loneliness could be crushing, especially during long winter nights when the wind howled around their cabins and they wondered if they'd made the right choice. Yet they persevered. They proved that women could handle men's work without breaking a sweat or losing their femininity. They demonstrated that marriage wasn't the only path to security and happiness. Most importantly, they showed their children, both sons and daughters, that strength comes in many forms, and that tradition isn't always right. Their rebellion against expectations created ripple effects that reached far beyond individual homesteads. These widows became living proof that women deserved equal treatment under the law, equal opportunities in business, and equal respect in their communities. Their daily acts of defiance laid groundwork for broader changes in women's rights. But defying expectations was just the beginning. Some widows took their newfound independence and turned it into something even more remarkable. They became entrepreneurs who transformed entire communities. Most people think of Wild West women as either schoolmoms or saloon girls, but plenty of widows carved out a third path entirely. They became entrepreneurs, not the fancy kind with silk dresses and business cards, mind you. These were women who spotted opportunities in places where others saw only hardship. Take boarding houses, for instance. Every frontier town had men passing through, miners, cowboys, traveling salesmen and drifters with money burning holes in their pockets. A clever widow could turn her lonely homestead into a gold mine by offering clean beds and hot meals. The work was backbreaking, sure, washing sheets by hand, cooking for a dozen hungry men, and dealing with guests who sometimes forgot their manners. But the cash flow, steady as a heartbeat. Martha Wilson ran such an operation outside Tombstone, started with just 2 extra rooms after her husband died in a mining accident. Within 3 years she'd expanded to house 20 men at a time. Her secret weapon wasn't fancy cooking or pretty curtains. She simply enforced one iron rule: no drinking, fighting or swearing under her roof. Word spread fast that Wilson's place was where respectable men stayed, and she could charge premium rates. Then there were the supply stores. Every settlement needed someone selling flour, coffee, tools and ammunition. Most folks assumed only men could handle such businesses. Wrong assumption. Widows often made better shopkeepers because they understood exactly what frontier families actually needed versus what they wanted. Sarah Mackenzie proved this point beautifully in Colorado. Her husband left her with 3 kids and a mountain of debt after dying in a shootout. Instead of selling their small plot of land, she converted the front room into a general store. Her edge: she stocked practical items other stores ignored. Needles and thread, medicinal herbs, children's clothing that could survive rough play. The fancy stores in town sold imported luxuries, but Mackenzie sold survival. The really ambitious widows opened saloons, risky business, considering the reputation these establishments carried. But smart women could make saloons profitable without the usual troubles. They hired musicians instead of relying on gambling for entertainment. Served decent food alongside the whiskey. Most importantly, they kept troublemakers out before problems started. Kate Morrison's saloon in Deadwood became legendary for exactly these reasons. She banned weapons at the door, hired a piano player who knew every popular song, and served the best beef stew for 300 miles. Miners would ride for days just to spend an evening at Morrison's place. She made more money in 2 years than most ranchers saw in a decade. Postal services offered another golden opportunity. The government paid decent money for mail routes, especially to remote areas. Widows living along these routes could supplement their income by serving as postal stops. All they needed was a secure place to store mail and the grit to deal with stagecoach drivers at all hours. But here's where things get really interesting. Some widows became wealthy by following gold strikes and selling supplies to miners. These women weren't digging for gold themselves. They were mining the miners' wallets instead. Much smarter strategy, honestly. Consider the California gold rush. While thousands of men broke their backs searching for nuggets, women like Elizabeth Hayes made fortunes selling them picks, pans and provisions. Hayes started with a single wagon full of goods. By the end of the rush she owned 3 stores and employed 15 people. Her motto: gold is nice but guaranteed profit is better. The weird part is how these businesses often started by accident. A widow would bake extra bread to trade for supplies, and suddenly half the town wanted to buy her loaves. Or she'd take in 1 boarder for company, then realize she could house 6 more for serious money. Necessity bred innovation faster than any business school ever could. Of course, running a business as a woman brought unique challenges. Male competitors sometimes tried intimidation tactics. Suppliers occasionally refused to deal with female business owners. Banks rarely offered credit to women, forcing them to operate on cash-only basis. Yet, many thrived despite these obstacles. They built customer loyalty through reliability and quality service. Word-of-mouth advertising spread their reputations across vast distances. Soon enough, their businesses became essential parts of their communities. The most successful widow entrepreneurs shared certain traits. They worked longer hours than anyone else. Never let pride prevent them from learning new skills. Treated customers fairly but firmly, and they always kept detailed records of every penny earned and spent. These women proved that survival and prosperity weren't mutually exclusive. You could mourn your husband's death while building something meaningful from the ashes of tragedy. But business success was just one aspect of how widows adapted to frontier challenges. Their ability to defend themselves when words and money weren't enough would become equally crucial for survival. Running a homestead alone meant more than just growing crops and raising livestock. Widows quickly discovered that survival in the Wild West required a completely different kind of education. one that involved learning how to fight back when trouble came knocking. And trouble always came knocking. The reality was stark. A woman living alone with children became an instant target. Word traveled fast in frontier communities, and news of a widow's vulnerability spread faster than wildfire. Bandits, drifters, and even some neighbors saw these women as easy pickings. But here's where things get interesting. Many of these supposed easy targets had other plans entirely. Sarah McKinley of Kansas learned to shoot after her husband died in a farming accident. Her first lesson came from an unlikely teacher, a grizzled Civil War veteran who ran the local general store. He taught her that accuracy mattered more than speed, and that the sound of a rifle being cocked often stopped trouble before it started. Within 6 months, Sarah could hit a tin can from 50 yards. More importantly, she could do it while her hands were shaking from fear. The weapons of choice varied depending on what widows could afford and handle. Shotguns became popular because they didn't require perfect aim. Buckshot spread wide enough to hit moving targets. Rifles worked better for long-distance threats, like warning shots fired at approaching strangers. Some women preferred pistols they could hide under their aprons or keep by their bedside. A few got creative with household items, turning kitchen knives into throwing weapons and fireplace pokers into clubs. Then there were the clever defensive strategies that didn't involve firearms at all. Martha Prescott in Colorado rigged her cabin with simple but effective early warning systems. She scattered dried beans around her property perimeter. Anyone stepping on them at night created enough noise to wake her and her 3 children. Empty tin cans hung on strings near windows and doors served as makeshift alarms when the wind wasn't blowing. Many widows learned that looking dangerous was half the battle. They practiced quick-draw motions until they became second nature, even if their guns weren't loaded. Some kept multiple weapons visible around their property. A rifle by the door, a pistol on the kitchen table, ammunition boxes stacked where visitors could see them. The message was clear: this woman was prepared for trouble. Wild animals presented another deadly challenge that required different defensive skills entirely. Bears, wolves, and mountain lions didn't negotiate or run away when they heard footsteps. Elizabeth Hartwell in Montana discovered this the hard way when a hungry bear broke into her chicken coop. She grabbed her late husband's hunting rifle and fired 2 shots into the air. The bear fled, but Elizabeth realized she needed better strategies for protecting her livestock. Some widows built elaborate trap systems around their property. Simple snares caught smaller predators trying to steal chickens. Deeper pits disguised with branches and leaves could stop larger threats, though digging these traps required backbreaking work. A few women even learned to make noisemakers from old pots and pans, creating enough racket to scare off most wildlife. The most successful widows understood that self-defense meant more than just fighting. It meant avoiding fights altogether when possible. They learned to read approaching strangers, identifying potential threats before they got too close. Suspicious riders got met at property lines, not invited to the front door. Unknown visitors found themselves talking to women who kept their hands near weapons while being polite but firm about their boundaries. Training often came from unexpected sources. Former soldiers passing through taught military tactics. Native Americans shared knowledge about silent movement and tracking. Even other widows formed informal training groups, practicing together and sharing techniques that worked. Children learned these skills too, because a 10-year-old who could reload a rifle quickly might make the difference between life and death. Stories spread throughout frontier communities about widows who successfully defended themselves. Rebecca Stone reportedly faced down 3 armed men trying to steal her cattle, firing warning shots until they retreated. Mary Davidson allegedly used a combination of her rifle and her dog to chase off a group of claim jumpers who wanted her land. Whether these stories were completely true didn't matter. They served as both inspiration and warning. The psychological aspect of self-defense proved just as important as the physical skills. Widows had to overcome their fear while maintaining enough caution to stay alive. They learned to project confidence even when terrified, to make quick decisions under pressure, and to live with the knowledge that violence might visit them at any moment. But learning to fight back came with costs that went beyond just buying weapons and ammunition. The constant vigilance wore down even the strongest women, always checking shadows, always listening for unusual sounds, always wondering if today would bring trouble. It took a toll that few people understood. Still, these hard-won skills in self-defense gave widows something precious: the ability to sleep a little easier at night. Yet even the best-prepared widow couldn't handle every threat alone, and sometimes survival meant knowing when fighting wasn't enough. when it was time to seek help from the law itself. Fighting for your rights in the Wild West wasn't as simple as walking into a courthouse and demanding justice. Most frontier widows discovered the hard way that the law operated by a different set of rules when you wore a dress. But some refused to back down even when the odds were stacked against them like cordwood. Take Martha Henderson, who found herself battling 3 separate creditors after her husband died in a mining accident. The men claimed her late husband owed them money for equipment, supplies and labor. Problem was, Martha had never seen any receipts or agreements. These fellows figured a grieving widow would just hand over whatever they asked for without question. They figured wrong. Martha marched into the territorial courthouse with a coffee tin full of her husband's papers and demanded to see proof of these debts. The judge looked annoyed that she'd interrupted his card game, but Martha planted herself in that chair and refused to budge. She couldn't read all the legal language, but she could spot a forgery when she saw one. Turned out 2 of the 3 claims were complete fabrications. But here's where it gets interesting. Winning that first battle actually made Martha's life harder. Word spread that she was difficult and uppity. Other widows started showing up at her door with their own legal troubles, hoping she'd fight their battles too. Martha found herself accidentally running a one-woman legal aid society from her kitchen table. The most common fight involved land ownership. Husbands died without proper wills, leaving their property in legal limbo. Brothers, cousins and business partners would crawl out of the woodwork claiming they deserved a piece of the homestead. Some had legitimate claims, others were just opportunists who figured desperate widows made easy targets. Sarah Mitchell faced exactly this situation when her husband's brother showed up 6 months after the funeral with a handwritten note claiming half the ranch. The paper looked suspicious, the ink was too fresh and the handwriting didn't match other samples of her husband's writing. Sarah knew she was being conned, but proving it meant going to court against a man with connections in town. The legal system wasn't designed to help women win these fights. Judges were men, lawyers were men, juries were entirely men. Most of these fellows believed women couldn't handle business matters or property ownership. They'd rather see a widow remarry quickly or sell out to male relatives than maintain her independence. Court costs alone could bankrupt a struggling widow. Filing fees, lawyer payments and travel expenses to the county seat added up fast. Some women mortgaged their land just to pay for legal representation, which defeated the whole purpose of fighting to keep their property in the first place. Then there were the intimidation tactics. Men who wanted a widow's land or money weren't above making threats. Mysterious accidents happened to livestock. Fences got cut, wells got poisoned. The message was clear: drop your legal case or face the consequences. Law enforcement rarely investigated these incidents seriously, claiming they couldn't prove who was responsible. But some widows fought back with creative legal strategies. Elizabeth Morris couldn't afford a lawyer, so she spent weeks copying legal documents by hand and studying territorial law books. She discovered that her husband's business partner had been skimming money for years before his death. Instead of just defending herself against his claims, she countersued for theft and fraud. The partner settled out of court rather than face public exposure. Smart widows learned to document everything. They kept copies of contracts, receipts, and correspondence in multiple hiding places. Some buried important papers in waterproof containers, or left copies with trusted friends in different towns. When men tried to cheat them, these women had evidence to back up their claims. The few widows who won major court cases became local legends. Their victories encouraged other women to stand up for their rights instead of accepting whatever scraps men offered them. Word traveled fast in frontier communities, and successful legal challenges inspired copycats across the territory. Political activism grew naturally from these individual legal battles. Widows who'd been cheated by unfair laws started organizing to change those laws. They petitioned territorial governors, wrote letters to newspapers, and attended town meetings where women weren't usually welcome. Some got arrested for disturbing the peace, which only generated more publicity for their cause. Changes came slowly, but they came. Property rights for married women improved in some territories. Courts began requiring better documentation for debt claims against estates. A few jurisdictions even allowed women to serve on juries in civil cases, though criminal trials remained men only for decades longer. Legal victories taught frontier widows an important lesson: knowledge was power. The women who survived and thrived were often those who learned to read contracts, understand property law, and navigate the court system. But winning in court was just one survival skill among many. Sometimes the law couldn't protect you, and widows had to rely on more creative forms of self-defense. When your husband dies on the frontier, mourning becomes a luxury you can't afford. Sure, Society expected widows to wear black from head to toe for at least a year. But try milking cows in a heavy black wool dress when it's 90 degrees outside. Try fixing a broken fence post in yards of black fabric that catch on every splinter. Most frontier widows started out following the rules. They'd wrap themselves in black crepe, pin on their mourning jewelry, and look the part of the grieving woman. Then reality hit like a runaway horse. That fancy mourning dress, it lasted about 2 weeks before getting torn to shreds on farm work. Mary Catherine Jenkins wrote to her sister back east, "I buried my mourning dress the same day I buried my dignity. Can't plow a field in silk and sorrow." Smart woman. She switched to her late husband's work clothes within a month of his death. Here's where things get interesting. Some widows didn't just borrow their husband's clothes temporarily, they made a complete transformation. Hair got chopped short, voices got deeper, names got changed from Elizabeth to Ellie faster than you could say land deed. Why the disguise? Well, try walking into a saloon as a woman looking to hire farm hands. You'd get laughed out faster than a snake oil salesman at a doctor's convention. But walk in dressed as a man. Suddenly people took you seriously. Suddenly you could negotiate fair prices, hire reliable help, and conduct business without every conversation turning into a marriage proposal. Martha Matt Henderson ran her entire ranch for 3 years while dressed as a man. Her neighbors had no clue. She conducted all her business, sold her cattle, and even played poker with the local men every Thursday night. The truth only came out when she got kicked by a horse, and the doctor discovered her secret while treating her injuries. By then she'd earned so much respect that the community just shrugged and kept calling her Matt. But disguises weren't always about fooling everyone. Sometimes they were about safety. A woman traveling alone attracted the wrong kind of attention. Bandits saw easy targets. Drifters saw opportunities. But a young man traveling with a rifle, that was a different story entirely. The clothing itself became a survival tool. Long skirts caught fire easily around cooking flames. They snagged on farm equipment. They slowed you down when you needed to run from wild animals or dangerous men. Work boots lasted longer than delicate women's shoes. Sturdy pants protected your legs from thorns and cuts. Then there's the hair situation. Long hair was considered a woman's crowning glory. But glory doesn't keep you alive. Hair got caught in machinery. It took forever to wash and dry when water was scarce. Many widows discovered that short hair meant one less thing to worry about when you're already juggling 1,000 responsibilities. Some women found creative middle ground. They'd dress practically for work but keep one nice dress for church or town visits. They'd braid their hair during the week, but let it down on Sundays. It was a balancing act between survival and social expectations. The funny thing about appearances, they became a form of armor. A widow who looked tough and capable was less likely to be bothered by troublemakers. Men thought twice before trying to cheat someone who looked like they could handle themselves. Looking vulnerable invited problems. Looking strong prevented them. Black clothing had another problem. Nobody talks about. It showed every speck of dust, every animal hair, every splash of mud. Frontier life was messy. Black fabric required constant cleaning, and constant cleaning required time and resources most widows didn't have. Many switched to brown or dark blue, colors that hid the reality of hard work. Winter brought different challenges. Practical warmth beat fashionable mourning every time. Layers of wool, fur-lined boots and warm hats kept you alive. Frostbite didn't care if your outfit was socially appropriate. Some widows used their appearance changes to reinvent themselves completely. They shed their old identity along with their old clothes. Sarah became Sam. Margaret became Mike. They weren't just changing how they looked. They were changing who they could become in a world that limited women's opportunities. The transformation wasn't always permanent. Some widows would become men for specific tasks or trips, then return to women's clothing when it suited them. They treated gender presentation like a tool in their survival kit, useful when needed, dispensable when not. Critics back east wrote angry letters about frontier women abandoning feminine virtues. Easy criticism from people who never had to choose between propriety and survival. The strangest part, many of these disguised widows became local legends. Stories spread about the mysterious young man who could outwork anyone, outshoot most men, and disappeared whenever strangers came around asking questions. These legends often outlasted the women themselves. But changing your appearance was just the beginning of survival. Once you looked the part of someone who could handle frontier life, you actually had to prove it. That meant learning to navigate towns and handle the dangers that came with travel. skills that would determine whether independence meant freedom or disaster. Getting into town meant stepping into a whole different kind of battlefield for frontier widows. The dusty main street might look peaceful, but every trip carried risks that went far beyond dodging horse manure and wagon wheels. Most widows couldn't just hop on their horse and ride into town whenever they felt like it. These trips required military-level planning. They had to time their visits around weather, make sure their children were safe at home, and figure out what to trade or sell for the supplies they desperately needed. Running out of salt or coffee in winter wasn't just inconvenient, it could mean months of bland food and no energy boost during the hardest season. Then there was the judgment factor. Small frontier towns thrived on gossip like bees on honey. A widow showing up in patched clothes with mud on her boots would spark conversations that lasted weeks. "Did you see how thin Mary's gotten? I heard she's been seen talking to that divorced man by the general store. Wonder if she can even afford those supplies she's buying." The weird part is, some of this gossip actually helped widows survive. Shopkeepers who heard about a widow's struggles might quietly slip extra flour into her order or forget to charge for small items. But the flip side meant that every mistake, every sign of weakness became public knowledge faster than wildfire. Smart widows learned to work the system. They'd befriend the store owner's wife, who often had real power over prices and credit. These relationships could make or break a widow's ability to get through tough times. Sarah Mitchell, a widow near Dodge City, became so close to the local store owners that they let her keep a running tab through 3 bad harvest seasons. Without that friendship, she would have lost her farm. Bartering turned into an art form during these town visits. Widows couldn't just walk in with cash like the men did. They showed up with baskets of eggs, wheels of cheese, hand-sewn quilts, or jars of preserves. The trick was knowing what people actually wanted versus what they claimed to want. Everyone said they needed practical items, but the widow who brought in fancy lace or good whiskey often walked away with better deals. Travel to and from town created its own set of nightmares. A lone woman on horseback or in a wagon screamed easy target to anyone with bad intentions. Stagecoaches offered some protection, but they cost money most widows didn't have. Plus, stage stops could be rough places where drunk men thought a woman traveling alone was fair game for unwanted attention. Some widows got creative with their safety strategies. Elizabeth Warren always traveled with her meanest rooster tied in a cage on her wagon seat. That bird would screech and attack anyone who got too close, giving her an early warning system and a vicious bodyguard all in one. Others wore their husbands' old clothes and hats, hoping to look like men from a distance. The timing of town visits mattered more than most people realize. Market days brought crowds but also better prices and selection. Weekends meant more drunks and troublemakers. Harsh weather kept the dangerous characters indoors, but made travel nearly impossible. Widows had to balance all these factors while their supplies dwindled at home. Let's not forget the children factor. Bringing kids to town meant watching them constantly in unfamiliar surroundings while trying to negotiate deals and gather information. Leaving them at home meant worrying the entire time about accidents, wild animals, or worse. Some widows solved this by partnering with neighbors. One would watch all the children while the other made the town run, then they'd switch next time. News gathering became almost as important as supply gathering during these trips. Towns served as information hubs where widows learned about weather patterns, crop prices, available work, and potential dangers in the area. The woman who missed hearing about an approaching blizzard or a gang of outlaws in the region could pay for that ignorance with her life. To banking, when it existed, created another whole set of challenges. Many widows had never handled money matters before their husbands died. They had to learn about interest, loans, and property taxes while grief was still fresh and money was scarce. Unscrupulous bank clerks sometimes took advantage of widows who seemed confused or desperate. Some widows discovered they actually preferred the independence of handling their own business dealings. Margaret Thompson shocked her entire town by successfully negotiating better prices than her late husband ever had. She claimed men tried to appear tough and ended up paying more while people felt sorry for her and gave her deals. But even successful town visits came with exhaustion that lasted for days. The constant vigilance, social performance, and physical demands of travel and heavy lifting wore these women down to nothing. Yet they kept making these trips because survival demanded it, and their children depended on the supplies and connections only towns could provide. What happened when widows couldn't make it to town at all became an entirely different survival challenge. Surviving on the frontier meant learning to eat whatever the land could provide, and Wild West widows became masters of this harsh reality. When the general store was 50 miles away and money scarce, a woman had to feed her family from whatever grew wild or could be caught with her bare hands. Wild onions, dandelion greens and lamb's quarters grew freely across the prairie. These weren't gourmet choices, they were lifelines. A widow might spend dawn hours gathering these plants, her children trailing behind with baskets, learning which leaves meant survival and which meant death. One mistake could poison the whole family, but experienced widows developed eagle eyes for edible plants, passing this knowledge down like precious heirlooms. Rabbits, prairie chickens and fish filled the protein gap when the last of the salted pork ran out. Some widows became crack shots with a rifle, dropping game at 100 yards. Others mastered the art of setting snares and traps, checking them each morning for the night's catch. Mary Hutchins, a Montana widow, reportedly fed her 4 children through an entire winter mainly on jackrabbits and wild turnips. Her neighbors called her the prairie magician. Then there was the art of stretching ingredients until they screamed for mercy. A handful of flour could become 3 different meals with the right tricks. Flour mixed with water and salt created hardtack biscuits that lasted for weeks. Add a bit of wild honey or maple syrup, and suddenly you had dessert. 1 cup of dried beans might feed a family of 6 if mixed with enough wild greens and roots. Preservation became a widow's secret weapon against starvation. Jerky wasn't just meat, it was insurance. Strips of venison or beef, dried in the sun or smoked over a fire, could last months without spoiling. Root cellars dug into hillsides kept vegetables fresh through winter. Some widows became so skilled at food preservation that neighboring families would trade goods for their expertise. Wild berries transformed bland meals into something approaching pleasure. Chokecherries, serviceberries and wild plums grew across much of the frontier. A widow might spend entire days picking berries with her children, filling every available container. These berries became pies, jams and dried fruit that added sweetness to the monotonous winter diet. The smart ones saved seeds to plant near their homesteads. Native American techniques proved invaluable for survival cooking. Pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat and berries, provided concentrated nutrition that travelers could carry for weeks. Some widows learned to make it from friendly tribal members, discovering it could sustain a person during the hardest times. This wasn't just food, it was portable hope. But the real magic happened when widows shared recipes and techniques. They'd trade secrets like military intelligence. Mix acorn flour with regular flour to make it last longer. Boil pine needle tea to prevent scurvy. Bury meat in snow to keep it fresh all winter. These weren't just cooking tips. They were survival strategies passed between women who understood the stakes. Wild herbs served double duty as both food and medicine. Mint eased stomach troubles while flavoring tea. Wild garlic fought infections and added taste to bland stews. Sage seasoned meat and cleared respiratory problems. A knowledgeable widow's herb garden was basically a frontier pharmacy with a restaurant attached. The cooking methods themselves required creativity and adaptation. Many homesteads had only a single pot and a wood-burning stove that heated unevenly. Widows learned to cook entire meals in layers: meat at the bottom, vegetables in the middle, bread on top. 1 pot, 3 courses. Dutch ovens became miracle workers, buried in coals to bake bread while stewing meat simultaneously. Water scarcity added another layer of difficulty to frontier cooking. In drought years, every drop counted. Widows learned to cook with minimal water, reusing the same liquid for multiple purposes. Meat broth became soup base, then bread liquid, then finally washing water for dishes. Nothing went to waste when survival hung in the balance. Some widows discovered they could make money from their food skills. They'd sell fresh bread to passing travelers, trade preserved meats for manufactured goods, or provide meals for bachelor neighbors who couldn't cook to save their lives, literally. These small food enterprises sometimes grew into thriving businesses. Winter tested every food preparation skill a widow possessed. Months of cold weather meant living entirely off stored and preserved foods. The smart ones had root cellars packed with potatoes, carrots and turnips. Smokehouses held enough jerky and dried fish to last until spring. Failures in food preparation during summer and fall meant potential starvation when snow blocked all supply routes. Food sharing created unexpected bonds between frontier women. When one family faced starvation, others would contribute what they could spare. A bowl of soup here, a loaf of bread there. These gestures built the social networks that helped everyone survive the hardest seasons. While mastering the art of frontier cooking kept bodies fed, widows still faced the challenge of staying connected to the outside world through letters and newspapers. Communication in the Wild West moved slower than molasses in winter, but for widows, letters and newspapers became lifelines to the outside world. While their husbands were alive, many women relied on their spouses to handle correspondence and news gathering. Death changed that equation fast. The local post office, if you were lucky enough to have one within riding distance, operated maybe twice a week. Mail carriers faced bandits, terrible weather, and broken-down horses. A letter from back east could take months to arrive, assuming it arrived at all. But here's the thing, widows learned to work this system like nobody's business. Martha Henderson from Colorado Territory wrote to her sister in Philadelphia every 2 weeks, whether she had news or not. She figured that keeping regular contact meant someone would notice if the letters suddenly stopped coming. Smart thinking, considering she lived 40 miles from the nearest neighbor. Her sister saved every letter, and years later, those pages told the whole story of frontier survival better than any history book. Then there's the newspaper situation. Most frontier towns had exactly one paper, usually run by some fellow with strong opinions and questionable spelling. These papers cost precious cents that widows couldn't always spare. The solution? Community reading. Women would pool their money, buy one copy, and pass it around like a prized possession. Newspapers served purposes beyond just news. The classified section became a goldmine for resourceful widows. Widow seeks employment as cook or housekeeper. References available. Eggs and butter for sale, reasonable prices. Seeking correspondence with gentlemen of good character for possible matrimony. Makes sense, right? These tiny ads connected isolated women to opportunities they'd never find otherwise. But wait, there's more to this story than simple correspondence. Some widows discovered they could make money through the mail system itself. Elizabeth Porter in Wyoming Territory started writing weekly reports about local happenings and selling them to newspapers in Denver and Salt Lake City. $5 per report doesn't sound like much, but it bought flour for a month. The weird part is how literacy became a survival tool in ways nobody expected. Widows who could read and write often found themselves serving as unofficial secretaries for their illiterate neighbors. They'd write letters for homesteaders trying to bring family west, or help translate legal documents that arrived in the mail. This service usually came with payment in goods. A chicken here, some preserved meat there. Well, not every widow could read when her husband died. The frontier had plenty of women who'd never learned their letters. These women faced extra challenges, but they found creative solutions. Many formed partnerships with literate neighbors, trading work for letter-writing services. Others taught themselves using whatever books they could find, usually the Bible or an old almanac. Newspaper ads also revealed the desperate situations many widows faced. Will trade quilt-making services for winter provisions, seeking family to adopt 2 young children, mother unable to provide. Reading between the lines of these advertisements tells stories of heartbreak and impossible choices. The mail system created unexpected connections too. Widows in different territories began corresponding with each other, sharing advice about everything from dealing with livestock to preserving food. These letter networks spread practical knowledge across hundreds of miles. A trick for keeping wolves away from chickens, discovered in Montana, might save a widow's livelihood in New Mexico months later. Let's not forget the romance angle. Lonely Hearts advertisements filled newspaper columns, and many widows used them strategically. They weren't always looking for love. Sometimes they needed business partners or help with heavy farm work. A correspondence with gentlemen might really mean looking for someone to help fix my roof in exchange for home-cooked meals. Some widows got creative with their postal strategies. They'd address letters to themselves from fictional relatives back east, then spread word around town about their wealthy family connections. This little deception sometimes convinced local merchants to extend credit or treat them with more respect. Clever, if slightly dishonest. The seasonal nature of mail delivery created its own challenges. Winter often cut off postal service completely for months. Widows learned to send important letters in fall, knowing they might not hear back until spring thaw. Emergency communications became impossible, making self-reliance even more critical during harsh weather. Newspapers also provided something precious that's easy to overlook: entertainment. After long days of back-breaking work, reading about events in distant cities offered mental escape. Stories about theater performances in San Francisco or political happenings in Washington gave isolated women connection to the broader world. But here's where the mail system really proved its worth for frontier widows. It preserved their stories. Letters home documented daily life, struggles, and triumphs in ways that might otherwise have been forgotten. These women were creating historical records without realizing it, one letter at a time. Of course, all this correspondence and newspaper reading required something many widows struggled to afford: lamp oil for nighttime reading and writing. But even this obstacle couldn't stop determined women from staying connected to the world beyond their homestead borders. Understanding how to navigate postal services and newspaper networks gave widows distinct advantages in their daily battle for survival, but literacy and communication skills meant nothing when sickness struck without warning. When you're down to your last handful of flour and winter's knocking at your door, pride becomes a luxury you can't afford. Wild West widows faced this harsh reality more often than they'd care to admit. The same women who could shoot a rattlesnake at 20 paces or birth a calf in a blizzard sometimes had to swallow their dignity and ask for help. Churches served as the backbone of frontier charity, but their resources were about as thin as Sunday soup. Most congregations barely had enough to keep their own doors open, let alone feed every struggling family in town. Yet when a widow showed up at Sunday service with patches on her patches, the collection plate might mysteriously grow heavier that week. Reverends often kept mental notes of which families needed help most, though they had to be careful not to embarrass anyone in the process. The charity game had unspoken rules that every widow learned fast. You couldn't just waltz in and demand handouts. You had to prove you'd tried everything else first. Lost your husband to consumption? Expected. Sold your good china and wedding ring? Smart thinking. Still wearing a dress without holes? Well, maybe you weren't desperate enough yet. Towns organized charity drives with the enthusiasm of a barn raising, but the results were often disappointing. A typical collection might yield 3 canned peaches, a bag of dried beans, someone's old work boots, and a quilt that had seen better decades. Still, these meager offerings could mean the difference between making it through January or not. Female asylums existed in larger settlements, though calling them generous would be stretching the truth. These institutions packed widows and their children into cramped quarters with all the warmth of a root cellar. The lucky ones got a cot and 1 meal a day. The unlucky ones got turned away because there simply wasn't room. Most widows viewed these places as a last resort, right before giving up entirely. Then there were the community raffles, where neighbors bid on donated goods to raise money for struggling families. Mrs. Henderson's apple pie might fetch 50 cents, while old Jake's hand-carved tobacco pipe could bring in a whole $1. The widow in need usually had to sit there and smile while the whole town discussed her financial troubles like they were debating the weather. Pride complicated everything naturally. Some widows would rather eat grass than accept charity, viewing handouts as a mark of failure. They'd send their children to bed hungry before admitting they couldn't provide. Others learned to navigate the charity system like seasoned politicians, knowing exactly which heartstrings to pull and when. The most successful charity recipients developed what you might call strategic humility. They'd mention their struggles casually during conversations, never outright begging, but letting others connect the dots. Little Mary's been coughing something fierce, but I reckon it'll pass, often translated to "we need medicine money but I'm too proud to ask directly." Churches sometimes offered work in exchange for help, which made the arrangement feel less like charity and more like employment. A widow might clean the sanctuary for a bag of potatoes or mend choir robes for a side of bacon. These arrangements preserved dignity, while filling empty stomachs, though the pay was hardly generous. Seasonal charity followed predictable patterns. Christmas brought the most donations, with families sharing extra food and hand-me-down clothes. Spring meant less giving as everyone focused on planting and their own survival. Summer charity was practically non-existent unless someone faced a genuine emergency. The charity network had its own gossip mill that would make modern social media jealous. Word spread quickly about who was receiving help and who was giving it. Generous donors earned community respect, while stingy neighbors faced quiet judgment. Widows receiving aid walked a tightrope between gratitude and maintaining their reputations. Some widows discovered that accepting charity came with strings attached. Donors sometimes expected ongoing gratitude, regular updates on how their gifts were used, or even influence over family decisions. A bag of flour might come with unsolicited advice about child rearing or suggestions about remarriage prospects. Children often served as unofficial charity ambassadors, their innocent comments about empty cupboards or patched clothes moving hearts more effectively than any adult plea. Smart widows learned that a well-timed mention of their children's needs could open doors that direct requests couldn't budge. The most innovative widows found ways to give back even while receiving help, creating informal networks of mutual aid. They might trade childcare for vegetables or mend clothes in exchange for firewood. These arrangements felt more like partnerships than charity, preserving everyone's dignity in the process. Charity wasn't just about survival goods either. Information became a valuable commodity that generous neighbors shared freely. Tips about where to find work, which stores offered credit, or how to treat sick livestock could prove more valuable than a basket of food. But accepting help wasn't the end of every widow's story. Many who received charity during their darkest hours later became the ones organizing collections for other struggling families. They understood the delicate balance between offering help and preserving dignity because they'd walked that narrow line themselves. The wheel of frontier charity kept turning, with widows moving from recipients to donors as their circumstances changed, creating a community safety net that somehow held together despite its frayed edges. The physical hardships of frontier life were brutal enough, but the emotional toll on widows often proved even more devastating. When a woman lost her husband on the frontier, she didn't just lose a partner, she lost her primary source of emotional support, conversation and companionship in an already isolated world. The grief hit like a thunderbolt, but there was rarely time to process it properly. Many widows described feeling completely abandoned by the world. Their husbands had been their link to the outside community, handling most interactions with neighbors, traders and townspeople. Suddenly, they found themselves thrust into a social void where every conversation felt awkward and every decision fell squarely on their shoulders. The silence in their cabins became deafening, broken only by children's voices or the endless prairie wind. While the frontier had its own twisted way of dealing with mental health, it mostly ignored it. There were no therapists, no support groups, no medications for depression or anxiety. Widows were expected to buck up and carry on because survival depended on it. But the human mind doesn't always cooperate with survival needs, does it? Prairie madness was a real and recognized phenomenon among frontier settlers, particularly affecting women. The vast emptiness of the landscape, combined with social isolation and constant stress, drove some people to complete mental breakdowns. Widows were especially vulnerable. They'd stare out at endless grasslands or desert, feeling like the only person left on earth. Some talked to themselves constantly. Others stopped talking altogether. The weird part is how different women coped with their grief. Some threw themselves into physical labor with almost manic intensity, working from dawn until they collapsed from exhaustion. They'd plow fields with tears streaming down their faces, or chop wood while muttering angry conversations with their dead husbands. Physical exhaustion became their sleeping pill, and their therapy rolled into one. Then there were the widows who found comfort in routine and ritual. They'd set the table for too long after their husband's death, or continue cooking his favorite meals. Some kept talking to their deceased spouse throughout the day, asking for advice or sharing the day's events. Neighbors might think it strange, but it kept these women functional when nothing else could. Religion offered the most common source of emotional relief. Bible reading, prayer, and hymn singing filled the terrible quiet hours. But many widows found strength in believing they'd reunite with their husbands in heaven, which made their current suffering feel temporary rather than permanent. Church attendance, when possible, provided both spiritual comfort and rare social interaction with other struggling souls. Music became another lifeline for many. Widows would sing while they worked, play simple instruments if they owned them, or teach their children songs their husbands had loved. The melodies carried memories but also hope. Some women wrote their own songs or poems, pouring their grief and loneliness into creative expression that nobody else would ever see. But why did some widows handle the mental strain better than others? Experience played a huge role. Women who'd already faced hardship, illness or previous losses seemed better equipped to process grief while maintaining their daily responsibilities. Those who'd been completely sheltered by protective husbands often struggled more with the sudden independence. Shared stories became incredibly powerful medicine when widows did encounter each other. They'd swap tales of their worst moments, the nights they cried themselves to sleep, the times they screamed at the sky, or the days they couldn't get out of bed. Hearing that other women had survived similar darkness provided hope that they could too. Let's not forget that children often became both the source of strength and additional stress for grieving widows. Seeing their mother's pain frightened kids, but their needs forced widows to function even on their darkest days. Many women later credited their children with saving their sanity by giving them a reason to keep going when everything else seemed pointless. Some widows developed what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress symptoms. They'd startle at every sound, convinced that danger was approaching. Others became obsessed with preparing for disasters, stockpiling food and supplies far beyond reasonable needs. These behaviors weren't considered mental health issues, they were just accepted as part of frontier life's harsh realities. The community's role in widow mental health varied wildly from place to place. Supportive neighbors might check in regularly, bringing food or company during particularly difficult periods. But judgmental communities sometimes made things worse, criticizing widows for grieving too long or not long enough, for working too hard or not hard enough. Strength wasn't measured by the absence of pain, it was measured by persistence despite the pain. Widows who openly struggled with grief weren't considered weak if they continued meeting their responsibilities. The frontier understood that survival sometimes meant crying while you worked or talking to yourself while you cooked. Recovery wasn't a destination, but an ongoing process that looked different for every woman. While mental health challenges tested every widow's limits, many discovered inner reserves of resilience they never knew existed. Their emotional survival skills would prove just as crucial as learning to split wood or shoot a rifle, especially when it came to helping the next generation thrive in an unforgiving world. When your husband dies and leaves you with 3 kids on a frontier homestead, finding steady income becomes more urgent than grief itself. Teaching school offered one of the few respectable jobs that paid actual money instead of just promises and IOUs. Well, decent money anyway. Most frontier towns desperately needed teachers. Children were growing up wild as tumbleweeds, unable to read their own names or count past 10. Parents knew education mattered, but who had time to teach when survival took every waking hour? Enter the widows, many already educated beyond the average settler, suddenly needing work that didn't require lifting 100-pound grain sacks. The requirements weren't exactly Harvard standards. Could you read, write legibly, handle basic arithmetic without counting on your fingers? Congratulations, you might just qualify. Some school boards cared more about finding any warm body than checking credentials. Others demanded proof of moral character, which usually meant being properly widowed rather than divorced or never married. Teaching came with real benefits that made the job attractive beyond the modest salary. Housing was often included, a small room attached to the schoolhouse or boarding with a local family. Free meals sometimes sweetened the deal. For a widow scraping by on her homestead, steady shelter and food meant survival through another harsh winter. But here's where frontier teaching got interesting. These weren't one-room schoolhouses like the pretty pictures suggest. Many were literally just rooms, sometimes in the back of a general store, a corner of someone's barn, or even outdoors when weather allowed. Desks, luxury items. Children sat on split logs, wooden crates, or brought their own stools from home. Age mixing created daily chaos that would terrify modern teachers. 6-year-olds learning their ABCs sat next to 16-year-olds struggling with long division. The teacher handled every grade level simultaneously while managing discipline, building fires and cleaning the space. One widow in Kansas taught 43 students ranging from age 5 to 19 in a converted chicken coop. Then there's the reality of frontier children themselves. These weren't sheltered kids worried about playground politics. Many carried knives, knew how to shoot, and had responsibilities that would overwhelm adults today. They respected toughness and tested new teachers mercilessly. Weak instructors got eaten alive faster than fresh meat left outside overnight. Smart widows learned to establish authority immediately. Martha Henderson in Colorado famously threw the biggest troublemaker out the door on her first day, literally picked him up and tossed him outside like a sack of potatoes. Word spread quickly that the new teacher wouldn't tolerate nonsense. Parents appreciated firm discipline since they had no time for school behavioral problems. Materials were whatever you could scrape together. Textbooks were rare treasures, often shared among multiple children or completely non-existent. Widows improvised lessons using newspapers, catalogs, and whatever printed material existed. Writing practice happened on bark, flat stones, or in dirt when paper ran out. Arithmetic lessons used beans, rocks, or anything countable. Teaching also meant becoming the community's unofficial everything else person. Need someone to write a letter? Call the teacher. Want a will drafted? Teacher again. Dispute about property boundaries? Bring it to the school mom who could actually read the land documents. These extra services often provided additional income through small fees or bartered goods. The social status was complicated. Teachers commanded respect for their education and role, but widowed teachers faced constant scrutiny. Every decision was judged. Dress too plain, and people whispered about setting poor examples. dressed too nice, and they questioned whether teaching salaries were too generous. Remarrying meant losing the job in many communities. Married women belonged at home, not in classrooms. Weather made frontier teaching an extreme sport. Blizzards could trap teachers and students together for days. Prairie fires required quick evacuations. Floods turned schoolhouses into islands. Heat waves made enclosed spaces unbearable, while cold snaps froze ink solid. Flexible scheduling wasn't educational philosophy, it was survival necessity. Some widows discovered teaching talents they never knew they possessed. Elizabeth Crawford in Wyoming started with basic reading lessons and ended up teaching advanced mathematics to future engineers. Her students went on to build railroads and design mining operations. Not bad for someone who learned fractions by dividing cornbread among hungry children. The seasonal nature of frontier education worked well for widowed homesteaders. Schools typically closed during planting and harvest seasons when children were needed for farm work. This allowed teacher widows to tend their own land during crucial times while maintaining steady employment during slower periods. Teaching connected widows to community life in ways isolation never could. They heard all the local news, met every family, and became trusted advisors on matters far beyond education. Many found this social connection as valuable as the paycheck. Loneliness killed frontier spirits faster than harsh winters killed bodies. But teaching wasn't just about immediate survival. Some widows used their positions to quietly advance ideas that would reshape frontier society, and that influence extended far beyond the schoolhouse walls into areas that would surprise modern educators. Getting sick or hurt on the frontier meant one thing for widows. You were your own doctor, nurse, and pharmacist all rolled into one. No medical school required, just desperation and whatever herbs you could find growing nearby. Willow bark became liquid gold when someone had a fever. Widows learned to strip it, boil it, and force the bitter tea down sick throats. The stuff actually worked too. Turns out it contains the same ingredient as modern aspirin, but back then they just knew it stopped the pain and brought down fevers. Trial and error taught them which dose helped, and which dose made people sicker. Garlic wasn't just for keeping vampires away. Crushed garlic cloves got packed into infected wounds, and widows made their children eat raw cloves when they showed signs of getting sick. The smell was awful, but garlic really does fight infection. These women figured that out without any fancy medical training. Then there were the truly desperate remedies. Spider webs got pressed into cuts to stop bleeding, and surprisingly that worked because spider silk is naturally antiseptic. Moldy bread went on wounds too, which sounds disgusting until you realize they were accidentally using penicillin centuries before doctors discovered it officially. But here's where things got really tough. When smallpox hit a community, widows often became the unofficial nurses for everyone. They'd move from house to house, caring for sick families while risking their own lives and their children's lives. Many caught the disease themselves and died, leaving their own kids orphaned. The bravery was incredible, but the cost was brutal. Broken bones presented their own nightmare. Setting a fracture without proper tools meant using whatever was handy: wooden spoons, fence posts, or torn petticoats for splints. Some widows got pretty good at it, but plenty of people ended up with crooked arms or legs that never healed right. Walking with a permanent limp was better than dying though. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Widows often served as midwives for other women, learning by watching and helping. They knew which herbs might ease labor pains or stop excessive bleeding afterward. Raspberry leaf tea, they discovered, actually does help strengthen the uterus. But when complications arose, they were flying blind. Many women and babies died during difficult births, despite everyone's best efforts. Winter brought its own medical challenges. Frostbite was common, and widows learned to gradually warm frozen fingers and toes, not quickly heat them up. They knew that black dead tissue meant amputation was coming. Some became surprisingly skilled with kitchen knives and sewing needles, performing crude surgery when gangrene set in. The alternative was death. Snake bites happened regularly during warmer months. Widows learned to cut X marks over the puncture wounds and suck out venom, though this probably didn't help much and was dangerous for the person doing the sucking. Whiskey got poured on everything: wounds, snake bites, and down the throats of people in pain. At least it cleaned things and provided some numbing relief. Mental illness was harder to treat. Prairie madness, as they called it, struck many isolated people. Widows dealing with grieving, stressed neighbors sometimes just sat with them, talking and providing human contact. They knew loneliness could drive people to dangerous behavior. Some widows became the unofficial counselors for their communities, listening to troubles and offering practical advice. Dental problems were pure misery. Toothaches got treated with clove oil or whiskey, but when teeth went bad, they had to come out. Widows learned to tie string around loose teeth and yank them out quickly. For stubborn teeth, they used pliers meant for farm work. No painkillers except alcohol, and infections afterward were common. Burns from cooking fires and hot stoves were daily risks. Widows discovered that aloe plants, when they could find them, soothed burned skin. Honey worked too, and they learned that keeping burns clean and covered helped prevent infection. But severe burns often meant death from infection or shock, no matter what treatment they tried. Some widows developed reputations as skilled healers and got called to help with medical emergencies throughout their area. They'd ride miles on horseback, carrying bags of herbs and crude medical supplies. These women saved countless lives and became respected figures in their communities. The knowledge got passed down from woman to woman, mother to daughter. Recipes for remedies were shared like cooking instructions. Everyone learned which plants to avoid and which ones might save your life. This informal medical network kept frontier communities alive when no real doctors were available. While these frontier widows were becoming skilled at treating illness and injury, they were also discovering something equally powerful, the healing that came from connecting with other women who understood their struggles. The bonds they formed would prove just as important as any herbal remedy. Surviving alone on the frontier could drive a person to madness. The endless silence, the constant worry, the crushing weight of doing everything yourself, it was enough to break anyone. But here's what nobody talks about. Wild West widows figured out something brilliant. They discovered that friendship wasn't just nice to have, it was absolutely essential for staying alive. Most frontier towns had at least 3 or 4 widows scattered around the area, sometimes more, depending on how many men the latest outbreak of cholera had claimed, or how many gunfights had gone badly. These women started finding each other, almost like they had some kind of invisible radar for shared misery. The Widow's Circle wasn't some fancy social club with printed invitations. It was pure survival strategy disguised as friendship. Martha Jenkins might show up at Sarah Coleman's door on Tuesday morning with a basket of eggs. Sarah would trade back some fresh bread and maybe a jar of preserved peaches. But the real exchange was much more valuable: information, companionship, and the kind of help that kept families fed through winter. These circles worked because they solved practical problems. When little Tommy broke his arm falling off the barn roof, his widowed mother didn't have to panic alone. 3 other women showed up within hours. One knew how to set bones from years of patching up farm accidents. Another brought soup and stayed to help with chores. The third took Tommy's younger siblings home for a few days, so his mother could focus on nursing him back to health. Then there's the childcare angle that made everything possible. A widow couldn't leave her homestead for a full day to go trading in town if she had small children to watch. But if Sarah watched Martha's kids one week, Martha could return the favor the next. This simple arrangement opened up opportunities that would have been impossible otherwise. Suddenly, widows could attend town meetings, spend proper time bargaining at the general store, or even take a paying job for a few days. Knowledge sharing kept these groups alive in the most literal sense. Agnes Miller discovered that chewing willow bark helped with her terrible headaches. Within a month, every widow in the circle knew this trick. When Elizabeth Harper figured out how to make soap last twice as long by adding wood ash in just the right proportion, that recipe spread faster than gossip. These women created their own informal university of survival skills. The weird part is how these friendships handled the topic of remarriage. Most outsiders assumed widows would be competitive about eligible men. After all, there weren't exactly dozens of bachelors wandering around looking for wives with ready-made families. But widow circles often worked together on this front too. They'd share information about which men were decent prospects and which ones to avoid like the plague. When Henry Thompson started courting both Martha and Sarah at the same time, they compared notes and decided he wasn't worth either of their attention. Security became a group effort, in ways that would surprise modern people. These women developed elaborate systems for checking on each other. If smoke didn't rise from Helen's chimney by 8 in the morning, someone would ride over to investigate. If bandits were spotted in the area, messages flew between homesteads faster than telegraph wires. Some circles even worked out coded signals, specific ways of hanging laundry or positioning tools that meant everything's fine or send help immediately. Winter planning turned into a community project that saved lives. The women would meet in late fall to pool resources and knowledge, who had extra firewood to share, whose root cellar was running low on vegetables, which families needed help slaughtering and preserving meat before the first hard freeze. They'd create informal agreements that ensured everyone had enough supplies to survive until spring. No widow had to face those brutal months completely alone. But let's not forget the emotional support that kept these women sane. Prairie madness was real. The isolation and stress could drive people to complete mental breakdown. Having friends who understood exactly what you were going through made all the difference. They could laugh together about the absurdity of their situations. They could cry together when the grief became overwhelming. They could share stories about their dead husbands without having to explain or apologize. These circles also created informal power in communities that often ignored women's voices. A group of widows supporting each other carried more weight than individual women trying to solve problems alone. When the town council wanted to raise taxes on property that included homesteads, 5 widows showing up together to object got more attention than one widow complaining by herself. The most successful circles lasted for years, creating bonds stronger than blood family. Women who started as desperate neighbors became sisters in everything but name. Their children grew up together, treating the other widows as honorary aunts. Some of these friendships survived moves, remarriages, and decades of frontier life. Yet friendship alone couldn't solve every problem these women faced. While widow circles provided crucial support, there was still the question of passing essential knowledge to the next generation, and that required a completely different kind of teaching than anything most of these women had ever imagined. Wild West widows knew their hardest job wasn't surviving another winter or fighting off bandits. Their toughest challenge was preparing their children for a world that could snatch away everything in a heartbeat. These women became walking libraries of survival knowledge, desperately trying to cram decades of hard-earned wisdom into young minds before time ran out. Sarah Mackenzie lost her husband to a rattlesnake bite when her twin boys were barely 8 years old. She started teaching them to identify dangerous plants the very next day. Knowledge weighs nothing but saves everything, she'd tell them while showing them which berries would fill their bellies and which ones would kill them. By age 10, those boys could set rabbit traps, treat infected wounds, and negotiate prices at the trading post like seasoned merchants. But here's where it gets interesting. These widows didn't just teach survival skills differently. They threw out all the fancy gender rules that polite society clung to. Boys learned to mend clothes and cook meals just as thoroughly as their sisters. Girls mastered rifle shooting and horse breaking with the same intensity as their brothers. Mary Patterson made her daughter practice skinning rabbits every morning before breakfast. Squeamishness is a luxury we can't afford, she'd say, watching 12-year-old Emma work with steady hands. The teaching methods would shock modern parents. Children as young as 6 were handling knives, tending fires, and caring for livestock. These weren't child labor violations, they were survival prerequisites. When little Tommy Watson's mother fell sick with fever, the 7-year-old kept their family alive for 3 weeks by following exactly what she'd drilled into him. He milked their cow, gathered eggs, and even traded surplus milk for flour at the neighbor's place. Then there's the moral education aspect that most people overlook. Widows couldn't rely on fancy schools or Sunday sermons to teach right from wrong. They created their own systems using stories, proverbs, and real-world consequences. Elizabeth Morgan told her children the same story every night. Honest work feeds you twice, once in your belly, once in your soul. When her son tried to shortchange a customer at their small store, she made him walk 5 miles to return the extra penny and apologize face to face. Writing became another crucial teaching tool. Many widows kept detailed journals not just for their own sanity, but as instruction manuals for their children. Catherine Bell's diary contained everything from weather prediction tips to recipes for soap made from animal fat. She made her oldest daughter copy important sections by hand, ensuring the knowledge would survive, even if the original journal was lost or damaged. The weird part is how these lessons often came through seemingly ordinary moments. While churning butter, mothers explained which plants attracted helpful insects to gardens. During evening mending sessions, they shared stories about reading people's character through their actions. One widow taught her children to identify dishonest traders by watching their eye movements during negotiations, a skill that served them well throughout their lives. Religious teaching took on practical dimensions too. Bible stories weren't just moral tales but survival guides dressed up in familiar language. The story of Joseph storing grain during good years became a lesson about preparing for harsh winters. David and Goliath taught children that courage and clever thinking could overcome bigger, stronger opponents. particularly useful when facing down claim jumpers or aggressive neighbors. Let's not forget the documentation aspect. Smart widows made their children write down important information, weather patterns, successful crop rotations, reliable water sources. All of it went into family record books. Young Martha Stevens could recite the exact dates of the last 5 hard freezes and which vegetables survived each one. This wasn't memorization for school tests. It was data that determined whether her family would eat or starve. The teaching extended beyond practical skills into psychological preparation. Children learned to expect hardship and find strength during dark times. Tears are fine for today, but tomorrow requires action, was how Ruth Coleman prepared her daughter for life's inevitable losses. These weren't harsh words but realistic preparation for a world that showed no mercy to the unprepared. Many widow-raised children became exceptional adults precisely because of this intense practical education. They could adapt to changing circumstances, solve problems creatively, and maintain hope during desperate situations. Some went on to become successful merchants, skilled craftspeople, or even community leaders who remembered the lessons their mothers hammered into them during those formative years. The legacy of this education system appears in letters and diaries scattered across museum collections. Adult children writing home often reference specific lessons their widowed mothers taught them decades earlier. "Remember what you said about reading the sky for weather signs? It saved my crop last season," wrote one son to his elderly mother. But this intense focus on preparing children for independence sometimes came with unexpected consequences. When these widow-raised children reached adulthood, many chose to keep moving west rather than settling down, a decision that would reshape entire regions. Or when everything fell apart on the homestead, some widows made a decision that shocked their neighbors. Instead of fighting to stay put, they packed up their children and headed west again. The same grit that kept them alive after their husband's death now pushed them toward an entirely new life, holding a wagon with whatever belongings they could carry. These women abandoned the land their families had worked so hard to claim. But here's the thing. Staying meant slow starvation or constant fear. Moving meant hope, even if that hope came wrapped in danger. The decision wasn't easy. Sarah Mitchell from Nebraska watched her crops fail 3 years running after her husband died in a farming accident. Her neighbors whispered that she was crazy when she sold her homestead for half its worth and bought passage on a westbound train. "That woman's lost her mind," they said. Sarah heard every word and kept packing anyway. Then there were widows like Mary O'Sullivan, who discovered that starting over in California meant real jobs. Factory work paid actual money, not the endless bartering that defined frontier life. City positions as maids, cooks, or seamstresses offered steady income that farming never guaranteed. The work was hard, sure, but so was plowing fields alone while your children went hungry. Railroad companies made traveling easier for these adventurous widows, though easier was relative. Train tickets cost money most didn't have, so many worked deals with conductors. Some cooked meals for passengers in exchange for passage, others cleaned cars or helped with luggage. A few enterprising women organized groups of families to travel together, splitting costs and sharing protection duties. Wagon trains still carried plenty of widows westward too. These women often became the unofficial doctors, teachers, and problem solvers for entire traveling groups. Their survival skills proved invaluable when wagons broke down or supplies ran low. Other families quickly learned that widows knew how to stretch food, treat injuries, and keep going when things got tough. The dangers were real though. Lone women with children made tempting targets for outlaws who haunted popular travel routes. Smart widows learned to travel in groups and never advertised their vulnerability. Some dressed as men during the most dangerous stretches of road. Others hired armed guards or convinced single men to pose as their husbands for protection. Weather could kill faster than bandits. Blizzards trapped trains for days, and desert heat claimed lives quickly. Widows traveling with sick children faced impossible choices when medicine ran out or water grew scarce. Yet many pressed on because turning back meant returning to certain failure. Cities offered opportunities that frontier towns never could. San Francisco needed seamstresses for its growing population. Denver hired women to run boarding houses for miners. Portland welcomed widows who could cook for lumber camps or teach school to settlers' children. The work was different, but the independence remained. Some widows discovered that their hard-won frontier skills made them valuable in unexpected ways. Women who learned to shoot, hunt, and defend themselves found work as guides or guards. Those who mastered herbal medicine became sought-after healers in towns without doctors. Skills that seemed ordinary on the homestead proved extraordinary in city settings. But moving meant leaving everything familiar behind. The graves of husbands stayed behind on abandoned homesteads. Neighbors who had shared tools and helped during harvest time became distant memories. Children lost friends and the only home they remembered. The emotional cost of starting over added weight to already heavy burdens. Community groups sometimes formed around these traveling widows. Entire neighborhoods of families would decide together that their current situation offered no future. They'd pool resources, plan routes, and move as a unit. These group migrations created instant support networks in new locations and shared the risks of long-distance travel. Letters home told mixed stories. Some widows found prosperity and happiness in their new surroundings. Others struggled with loneliness in crowded cities, or discovered that Western promises were just as empty as Eastern ones. A few wrote honestly about their regrets, wondering if staying put might have been the safer choice after all. The successful moves often depended on timing and luck as much as planning. Arriving in a boom town just as it needed more workers meant opportunity. Showing up after the boom ended meant competition for scarce jobs. Widows learned to research their destinations carefully, reading newspapers and writing letters to gather information before committing to the journey. Many of these traveling widows became bridges between different communities and cultures. They carried news, recipes, and customs from one place to another. Their children grew up with broader perspectives than kids who never left their birthplaces. These families helped knit together a growing nation through their willingness to keep moving forward. The courage required to abandon everything and start fresh revealed something remarkable about these women. They refused to accept limitation as permanent. When one path failed, they found another. Their willingness to travel toward uncertainty rather than accept certain hardship showed the same spirit that had brought their families west in the first place. But whether these bold moves toward new lives actually delivered the better futures these widows sought, well, that depended on much more than just their courage to leave everything behind. Wild West widows didn't just survive, they built the backbone of America. Their names might not fill history books like famous gunfighters or gold rush millionaires, but these women shaped entire communities with nothing more than grit and determination. Take Martha Morrison, who founded 3 schools in Colorado Territory after losing her husband to pneumonia. She started with 8 children crammed into her one-room cabin, teaching them to read using old newspapers and Bible verses. Within 5 years, her schools served over 200 kids across 3 towns. When the territorial government finally got around to funding education, they hired Martha as the district supervisor. Not bad for a woman who supposedly couldn't handle business decisions without a man's guidance. Then there's Sarah Chen, a Chinese-American widow who built the first permanent bridge across Willow Creek in Nevada. Local officials had argued about that bridge for years, but Sarah got tired of watching wagons get stuck and travelers drown during spring floods. She organized a community work crew, designed the structure herself, and somehow convinced everyone to contribute materials. The bridge stood for 40 years. They named the crossing Sarah's Span, though most folks just called it the good bridge that actually works. These women didn't wait for permission to make changes. They saw problems and fixed them, period. Wild West widows also revolutionized local law enforcement, though not always in ways you'd expect. Rebecca Turner in Wyoming Territory got so fed up with cattle thieves that she organized the first civilian patrol group, made up entirely of women. They took shifts watching the herds at night, armed with rifles and a healthy dose of frontier justice. Crime dropped 70% in their area within 6 months. When the territorial marshal finally arrived to establish official law, he kept Rebecca's patrol system and hired half her women as deputies. The influence went deeper than immediate problem solving. These widows challenged fundamental assumptions about women's capabilities. Hannah Rodriguez ran a freight company that delivered supplies across 4 states. She employed 12 men, negotiated contracts with mining companies, and never lost a shipment to bandits. Local newspapers initially treated her business as a curiosity, the lady freighter, who'd surely fail within months. 5 years later, she owned the most successful transport operation in the territory. Churches and charitable organizations owe much to widow leadership. Elizabeth Harper established the first orphanage in Arizona Territory after realizing how many children had lost parents to disease, accidents, and violence. She started by taking in 3 kids who were essentially living wild after their parents died of cholera. Word spread, and soon she was caring for dozens of orphaned children. Her system of placing older kids with farming families while keeping younger ones in group homes became the model copied across the West. Let's not forget the medical advances. Dr. Margaret Walsh, yes, she was actually a trained physician, became a widow when Apache raiders killed her husband. Instead of fleeing back east like everyone expected, she stayed and built the first real hospital between Santa Fe and California. She performed surgeries, delivered babies, and treated everything from gunshot wounds to smallpox. Her medical records show she saved more lives than any army doctor in the region. The weird part is how these accomplishments got downplayed or forgotten. Local newspapers would write about the brave widow who helped during the crisis, but rarely mentioned names or gave full credit. Historical records often listed their achievements under their deceased husbands' names, as if dead men were somehow still running businesses and building schools from their graves. But the evidence survived in unexpected places. Property deeds, court records, and business licenses tell the real story. Census data shows dozens of women listed as heads of households running everything from general stores to mining claims. Their children's memoirs describe mothers who could fix steam engines, negotiate with tribal leaders, and organize entire communities for survival. Several widows became unofficial mayors of frontier towns before women could legally hold office. They organized town meetings, settled disputes, and coordinated defense against threats. When territorial governments finally established formal positions, many widows stepped back rather than fight legal battles over their right to serve. They'd already done the work that mattered. The impact reached beyond individual achievements. These women proved that survival and success didn't require male protection or guidance. They raised daughters who expected to handle their own affairs and sons who respected women's capabilities. This shift in thinking spread through families and communities, gradually changing attitudes across the frontier. Their legacy lives on in place names scattered across the West. Towns, creeks, mountain passes, and bridges carry the names of women who refused to give up when widowhood struck. Some markers explicitly mention their widow status, while others simply honor the woman who built this place. Modern America inherited something precious from these determined survivors. The idea that anyone, regardless of gender or circumstances, can rebuild after disaster became deeply embedded in our national character. But their greatest legacy wasn't what they built with their hands. It was the proof they provided that strength comes from within, not from circumstance or social expectations. Today's challenges might look different, but the lessons remain surprisingly relevant. The grit and determination of Wild West widows didn't just fade into dusty history books. Their struggles carved out something much bigger than personal survival stories. These women fundamentally changed how Americans think about strength, independence, and what people can accomplish when life throws everything it's got at them. Take property rights, for instance. Before these widows started fighting for their land in courtrooms across the frontier, women had practically zero legal standing when it came to owning property. But when a widow in Montana successfully defended her homestead against 3 different men trying to claim it, or when another in Wyoming kept her ranch running better than her deceased husband ever had, people started paying attention. Laws that seemed set in stone suddenly looked pretty foolish. The legal changes came slowly, sure, but they came. State by state, territory by territory, lawmakers began recognizing that maybe women could handle more responsibility than society had been willing to give them. Some of these widows became the first women to vote in local elections, decades before the 19th Amendment made it official nationwide. Then there's the community support systems these women created, those widows' circles that formed in frontier towns. They became the blueprint for everything from church aid societies to modern food banks. When a group of widows in Kansas organized weekly meetings to share childcare, trade goods, and pool resources for emergencies, they were essentially inventing the mutual aid networks we still rely on today. The humor in their situation wasn't lost on them either. One widow wrote in her diary about how she'd become the best man in town after learning to shoe horses, fix wagon wheels, and outshoot most of the local cowboys. Another joked that she'd married her husband for better or worse, but nobody mentioned she'd also have to become a carpenter, veterinarian, and small-town diplomat all at once. But here's where their story gets really interesting. These women didn't just adapt to survive, they innovated. The boarding house industry in many frontier towns was essentially created by widows who needed income. The first female-owned businesses in countless Western communities belonged to women who'd lost their husbands and refused to lose their independence too. A widow in Colorado built the first hotel in her mining town and ended up wealthier than most of the miners she served. Their children carried forward lessons that shaped entire generations. Boys raised by widowed mothers learned that women could be just as tough and capable as men. Girls learned they didn't have to wait for rescue, they could solve their own problems. These kids grew up to become some of the most progressive voices in their communities, pushing for women's rights, better working conditions, and stronger community support systems. The educational impact was massive too. Widows who became teachers didn't just teach reading and arithmetic, they taught resilience. They showed students that setbacks weren't permanent, that creativity could solve almost any problem, and that asking for help wasn't weakness, it was smart strategy. Some of their innovations seem obvious now but were revolutionary then. The practice of women wearing practical work clothes instead of restrictive dresses, started by widows who couldn't fix a fence in a corset. The idea that women could handle financial decisions, proven by widows who managed family budgets, business accounts and property investments better than many men. The concept that single mothers could raise successful children, demonstrated by thousands of frontier widows whose kids went on to become teachers, business owners and community leaders. Their stories also changed how Americans viewed hardship itself. Before these women proved otherwise, struggling alone was often seen as shameful, needing help meant personal failure. But when entire communities watched widows face impossible odds with dignity and determination, the narrative shifted. Struggling became respectable. Asking for help became practical wisdom rather than weakness. The ripple effects reached far beyond their immediate communities. Eastern newspapers started running stories about frontier widows who'd built successful businesses or defended their homes against outlaws. These stories challenged everything polite society believed about women's capabilities. If a widow in Nevada could run a profitable trading post, maybe women everywhere deserved more opportunities. Modern disaster relief organizations trace their methods back to the informal networks these widows created. The idea that communities should rally around families facing crisis, that strong neighbors help weaker ones through temporary setbacks. Those concepts got their American testing ground in frontier towns where widows either received community support or faced certain failure. Even their approach to mental health was ahead of its time. These women understood that grief and trauma required both practical action and emotional support. They created informal counseling networks, shared coping strategies, and normalized the idea that surviving hardship was worth celebrating, not hiding. The Wild West widows proved something that still resonates today. When ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances, they often discover they're capable of extraordinary things. Their legacy lives on every time someone refuses to give up, builds community during crisis, or proves that strength comes in forms society doesn't always recognize. Their stories remind us that real courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward anyway.